bigotry and the evils of bigotry and so forth, and race hatred.
At first, the books had a pretty small following. They even went on hiatus for a few years because sales were kind of weak. But in the 1970s, the books caught the attention of a college student named Chris Claremont. Chris was studying political theory at Bard College, and he had a side job as an assistant at Marvel. He wasn't especially interested in comics. He thought the industry was dying out, and in his opinion, deservedly so, because he felt the characters were just too simple. So after graduating, he got a staff position as a writer, which he saw as a stepping stone to real work, publishing novels. But then, he heard talk around the Marvel office about reviving the X-Men. As a metaphor for people fighting for civil rights, they resonated with his background in political theory, and he thought maybe he could make the characters more interesting by writing them like a method actor, thinking through their background, every detail about their lives, to give them more depth. He asked if he could write a few issues, and the X-Men were held in pretty low regard, so nobody else wanted to do it. So
Chris Claremont took over, and somehow the stories became very complex. A lot more characters were introduced.
The idea of having strong, dynamic women characters at that point in the comics medium was very rare. And the idea of having a major black character at that point was very rare. Women then were basically defined as girlfriends, or the girls who got into trouble.
Chris's stories tackled darker themes, heroes who get corrupted and become villains, anti-mutant panics, a vision of the future where mutants are sent to concentration camps. These complex stories hit a nerve. Fans loved them, especially fans who might not see themselves in other titles.
Marvel told me that the demographic for the readership of the comics, I don't know whether it's true in the movies, is young blacks, young Jews, and young gays. These are all young people who feel that they feel a little bit like mutants, and so sympathize with them and want them to thrive and do well.
I spoke to Anthony Oliveira, a writer on many Marvel books, including an X-Men story for Marvel Voices Pride, about why the X-Men were so important to him.
I remember very distinctly when I got hooked on the X-Men. I was at a Scholastic book fair, and I really wanted some Spider-Man stuff because that was what I was into. And they didn't have any, but they had a book just said X-Men with Wolverine on the cover. It became an obsession of mine, and the metaphor of the text really lit up my childhood brain at a moment I really needed it. I was queer, I didn't know it, but I knew something was wrong. And the idea of the X-Men as a place where it was a community that knew the world hated it, but they were taking care of each other and they were friends and putting the lie to these narratives about them that were out there. I think it was the refusal to just make these characters the victim of history, that they were going to fight back and they were going to mold the way that the future would treat them, and that they were going to be active participants in their own narrative.
I also talked to J.P. Karliak, the voice of Morph on X-Men 97. For J.P., the X-Men were one of the few places you could find queer stories, even if they weren't explicitly queer.
Coding was really the only way to get authentic queer stories into a mainstream audience. I was picking up everything that they were dropping because I was so used to reading into those metaphors since I was a kid.
And by the way, if you want to see more of my full interviews with Anthony and JP, I'm posting those as separate videos and as an episode of my podcast. There's links to the full interviews below in the description. As important as the X-Men were to marginalized readers, because the stories were so good and fun and exciting, the books were also a mainstream hit. By the 1980s, the X-Men series was one of the most popular in the world. Comics distributors measured other comic books against an X-Men index, comparing the number of orders against orders for that month's X-Men. And it was around that time that the director, Richard Donner, made a successful big-budget version of Superman. Now, there was interest in doing the same with other comic characters. But getting the X-Men onto screens was an especially bumpy road. One of the first attempts was in 1984, by writers Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas. They'd earned some nerd cred for writing a script for Conan the Destroyer.
I suppose nothing hurts you.
Only pain.
And they took a pass at an X-Men script that is very different from what...
Wait, what?
Nerd cred for writing a script for Conan the Destroyer.
I suppose nothing hurts you.
Only pain.
Only pain.
An X-Men script that is very different from what you might expect. In this version, Xavier is an action hero rather than using a chair. The main villain isn't Magneto, but Carmilla, a mutant who eats humans and is based on a 19th century lesbian vampire. The heroes battle giant floating Easter Island heads that shoot lasers, and the film's climactic battle hinges on the X-Men incapacitating an opponent by tickling him. I wish that film had been made, but in addition to being bonkers, the script was very expensive. At the time, the film rights to the X-Men were held by Orion Pictures, a studio going through some financial trouble and on the verge of collapse. In fact, Orion's troubles were so bad, here's Billy Crystal describing them at the Oscars around this time.
Reversal of Fortune, about a woman in a coma. Awakenings, about a man in a coma. And Dances with Wolves, released by Orion, a studio in a coma. So...
Orion did not wind up making that film, and from there, the X-Men license bounced around a lot. In part, that was because Marvel was having financial issues of their own, and they kept selling short-term licenses for way cheaper than they probably should have. At one point, there was an X-Men project at a company called Lightstorm, with interest from a director that you've probably heard of.
I was part of the initial discussions that we had back in 89 and 90 with James Cameron and Lightstorm when they were going to produce the X-Men.
James Cameron, the director of Terminator, Titanic, Avatar. They even had a treatment written by Cameron's then-wife, Catherine Bigelow, and they were in talks with Bob Hoskins to play Wolverine, but things got in the way. First, Cameron got distracted by another project, because during an early meeting with Marvel, Stan Lee started talking about Spider-Man. And according to people who were there, James Cameron's eyes lit up. He leaned forward, he started asking questions, and before anyone knew what had happened, he decided to focus on making a Spider-Man film first, with Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker and Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Octopus, which honestly could work. But then the studio they were going to make it with went out of business, had to sell everything off, and both Cameron's X-Men and Spider-Man films evaporated.
I don't feel so good.
Then the rights bounced around a few more years from one studio to another. Each time, new executive would make a new round of changes, usually without ever reading the comics or understanding what made the X-Men work. And at the same time, there were a string of terrible movie adaptations of other Marvel properties. There was a low-budget version of The Punisher, Captain America, a Nick Fury movie with David Hasselhoff, a Roger Corman Fantastic Four that was never even released, and a film adaptation of Doctor Strange that took so long to make, the studio lost the license, but just changed the name and released it anyway.
Evil's ultimate warrior has arrived. Dr. Mordred.
And perhaps the most infamous, in 1986, George Lucas produced a Marvel film of his own.
I just can't resist your intense animal magnetism.
So, by the 90s, Marvel stories weren't exactly held in the highest regard in Hollywood. And on top of that, comic book and superhero movies in general had a terrible reputation. There had been a few hits, Superman and Tim Burton's Batman films, but there was also a string of high-budget bombs, going back to the 80s with Flash Gordon, and into the 90s with Tank Girl, Barbed Wire, The Phantom, Judge Dredd. So between Marvel's track record and all the comic book flops, it was looking pretty unlikely an X-Men film would ever get made. And given how Hollywood had treated their other books, Stan Lee figured maybe that was a good thing.
There have been people interested in doing an X-Men movie for a long time. They never could come up with the right story, the right approach, and having been burnt a number of times in the past by allowing people to do movie versions of our characters that were less than profound, we were very particular.
That gets us to the mid-90s. The license for the X-Men is sitting at 20th Century Fox. They'd picked it up for cheap at a Marvel fire sale, and they commissioned an animated after-school series. That was doing well, but one fan of the books thought it could be more. Scott Nimmerfro was a development executive at the Donner's Company, a relatively young production company that had a mixed record. The first film was Radio Flyer, a flop, and then Free Willy, a hit, and they needed to prove that their success wasn't just a fluke. Scott was a big nerd. He'd written episodes of Tales from the Crypt, Stargate, The Outer Limits. He'd go on to write for Voyager, and he suggested the Donner's Company consider a movie based on the X-Men. Executives weren't sure. Here's one of them, Lauren Schuler Donner.
I confess I knew of it, certainly, but I hadn't read it, any of the issues.
But she took a look at the animated series, and then she did something that not every executive had bothered to do. She actually read the comics. She was drawn to the metaphor that Stan and Jack and Chris and other creators had built, outsiders targeted by an intolerant society fighting for acceptance. And she was especially drawn to Wolverine.
This fella's rough and bad-tempered and he's mean, but you know that underneath it all, he's got a good heart.
Now, if anybody was going to tackle this film, the Donner Company made sense. Lauren's husband, who ran the company with her, had made one of the best-regarded superhero movies ever, 1978 Superman. And Lauren saw similarities.
I would liken this movie more to the beginning of the first Superman, where they were telling the tale of young Superman growing up, and it was more of a narrative story. It isn't big and over the top. It is very grounded in terms of character.
The more she thought about Scott's proposal,
and I started reading the other characters, and I called up Scott and I said, absolutely, we're making this movie.
So Lauren reached out to 20th Century Fox to see if they could put something together. As luck would have it, Fox already had a great director in mind, a new up-and-coming talent, and that was Paul W.S. Anderson, who just made the film Mortal Kombat. Fox executive named Peter Rice had been trying to interest Paul in an X-Men film. But like most people in Hollywood, Paul was a little wary about doing a comic book movie, so he passed, made Event Horizon instead, and then wound up doing all the Resident Evil films. But he wasn't the only young director on Peter Rice's radar. There was another named Bryan Singer. He was known for making small indie films, just won a lot of praise at Sundance for a little film called Public Access, and then he had a hit with a modestly made crime drama, The Usual Suspects. Now that might seem like a weird choice for a comic book movie, especially compared to the guy who just made Mortal Kombat, but Peter Rice, the Fox executive, saw that Bryan had a knack for character-driven stories with a large cast, and they wanted to find a project for him with a bigger budget than he'd ever had. Here's Singer's producing partner, Tom DeSanto.
Peter had sent Bryan the script for Alien 4. Peter just wanted Bryan to know, this was right after Usual Suspects, that Fox was thinking him for these larger projects. And I asked Peter, what about X-Men?
Fox and the Donners were open to Bryan directing an X-Men film, and when they offered it to him, he told them, "Oh, leave me alone, I'm never gonna do a comic book movie." But his producer, Tom, was a big X-Men fan, and he wasn't gonna let it drop. Tom gave Bryan some comics to read, and Bryan was skeptical, like a lot of people. He didn't think they were serious stories. But then, he read Chris Claremont's series God Loves, Man Kills, which is about a conservative preacher who labels the X-Men abominations, evangelizes against them, launches a plan to exterminate them. As a gay man, that story resonated with him. And also, the idea of finding a place where you can escape bigotry.
Every young person at some point in their life feels different. They feel strange. They feel like they don't belong. And they dream of going to a special place where they could be taken care of and loved for who or whatever they are.
Tom and Bryan started brainstorming ideas for a film that explored those themes. They wrote up a proposal, they showed it to Stan Lee, he loved it, and now they just needed a script. That was a rocky road too, because a lot of writers just didn't get what made the X-Men work. A parade of screenwriters attempted to tackle a script. Ed Solomon, who'd adapted Men in Black from a comic, John Logan, who wrote Gladiator, James Schamus, who went on to write the 2003 Hulk movie and produced Brokeback Mountain. At one point, Joss Whedon was brought in to fix the third act, and he discovered the problem with Act 3 was Acts 1 and 2. He totally redid the script, and then came to a read-through, only to discover another writer had rewritten his script. So, what was the problem? According to Tom DeSanto, none of the writers were taking the story seriously. They wrote fun, campy scripts, or pure action. They didn't deal with the ideas that had attracted fans to the franchise. Bryan wanted the script to serve as an analogy for many kinds of outsiders, including gay teens. He told one interviewer, "A gay kid doesn't discover he or she is gay until around puberty, and their parents aren't gay necessarily, their classmates aren't, and they feel truly alone in the world and have to find, sometimes never find, a way to live." That feeling of being alone in the world was central to the movie they wanted to make. But so far, none of the writers they hired were able to nail it. But there was one person close to the project who knew more about the X-Men than just about anybody else. That was Bryan's assistant, a 20-something aspiring actor named David Hayter. David's day job was answering phones, taking meeting notes in Bryan's office. But he wanted to do more creative work. He picked up some acting roles here and there. He voiced Captain America in a Spider-Man cartoon, Solid Snake in Metal Gear Solid. David was obsessed with the X-Men. After story meetings with writers, Bryan would ask him his opinion on scripts, get his feedback on characters. And over time, he came to rely on David more and more. Eventually, asked him to take the mediocre scripts and see if he could rewrite them. So David gave it a shot. And it turned out he was the first one who truly got what kind of film they wanted to make, including the queer allegory.
You know, it's really for anybody who feels exclusion, but, you know, we had a number of key creatives behind the camera and on camera who were gay, and so obviously that element was on our minds.
Executives realized this was the script they'd been waiting for. They called David into a meeting, told him they were going into production with a script that was a little more than half his contributions, And now they just needed to assemble a cast. That was going to be tough too, thanks to the bad reputation of Marvel movies and superhero films in general. And there were some truly bizarre casting ideas. At one point, Michael Jackson did a multimedia presentation about how he should play Professor X. Lauren Shuler Donner told him, "You do know Xavier is an older white guy." And Michael said, "Oh, yeah, I can wear makeup." More serious consideration was given to Ian McKellen. He'd worked with Brian on the film Apt Pupil, and when they asked if he was interested...
Have you seen Magneto in the comics? My God, that's a part you want to play. Thighs like this, and codpiece, boots, helmet, scarlet pecs.
But that wasn't the only draw.
Being a gay man, I'm often thought to be too dangerous and too unusual, too abnormal to be allowed into society as a whole. And therein lies my interest in mutants.
It was also an opportunity to work with another British actor he'd always admired, Patrick Stewart, captain on Star Trek and certainly no stranger to nerdy media.
There was movies like Life Force I did for Toby Hooper, Excalibur, and certainly Dune, of course. These things litter my career, and I'm not even a science fiction fan. I feel that I have done my time in front of green screen.
Patrick appreciated the ideas in the film as well.
There is a strong prejudice, which is in fact based on fear. These issues that are very relevant in society today of how we live with people who are different from ourselves and how we can create a society in which everyone can coexist together.
And getting talent of a certain caliber was helpful.
And I think once we had both Brian and Ian, other actors were aware that, this is this will be a much more interesting and complex movie.
Gradually, they assembled their team. To play an evil senator, Bruce Davison, also known as the man who commands rats to kill in the movie Willard. To play Jean Grey, Patrick Stewart was reunited with Famke Janssen, who'd appeared with him on Star Trek.
I'm an empathic metamorph.
Metamorph?
A mutant. A biological curiosity, if you will.
To play Rogue, Anna Paquin, who had a personal connection to the material since she was herself a queer teenager. But the casting of Wolverine was tricky. Initially, Bryan Singer wanted the actor Dougray Scott, but producers made him audition other actors too, including an Australian best known at the time for musical theater. When Hugh Jackman walked in, Singer said right in front of him, "I've got Dougray Scott playing the part. Why am I auditioning another guy?" And Hugh thought, well, he definitely wasn't getting cast. But plans changed, thanks in part to some intervention from a low-level executive who'd recently been promoted from an assistant job, a kid in his mid-20s named Kevin Feige. Now, we don't have time here for the story of how Hugh wound up playing Wolverine and how Feige wound up in charge of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. But if you want that story, I'm posting it in a bonus video over on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. So by late 1999, the cast was in place. They had a budget, though it was pretty modest, and they had a shooting schedule with plans to release the film in about a year, over Christmas. But they'd only been filming for a few days when Fox executives called. There was a gap in the release schedule, they said, and they were changing X-Men to a summer release. Brian thought, that's great, they'd have an extra 6 months to make the movie. But the studio told him no, they meant that coming summer. And that meant 6 months fewer to make the film. Now the pressure was even more intense, which is going to lead to a lot of sleepless nights. And if sleepless nights are a problem for you, you might want to take a look at this video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. I have always had trouble getting to sleep, and I've tried a lot of different solutions. Different positions, weird pillows, fans, no fans, sunlight clocks, all with mixed success. I wasn't sure a mask was going to help, but the very first time I tried sleeping with a mask from Manta Sleep, I fell asleep noticeably faster. There's just something so relaxing about being strapped in with this adjustable band. I feel like I'm entering Cerebro. Now I use it all the time, to sleep, to nap, to meditate. With the built-in Bluetooth speakers, I can listen to calming sounds. My favorite is a 12-hour loop of the Enterprise engine. And depending on your preferences, you can get a version made with silk, a weighted mask, a mask made of cooling pads, a mask with beads that release steam. Especially during the summer months, extra daylight can make it really hard to get to sleep. But Manta Sleep gives you total control over the sun itself. Head over to mantasleep.com and use code MATNAP10 to get 10% off your purchase, and big thanks to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the story of the X-Men and the difficult job of turning the comics into a film. Although the budget and the timing were tight, those weren't the only challenges faced by the first X-Men film. Another was how to handle the queer subtext. That was a crucial element for a lot of the people making it. But this was the late 90s, and very few mainstream movies had made queer allegories so central. So, with X-Men, and a few years later with X2, they had to find a way to tell a story that reflected queer life while also being a blockbuster summer action film appealing to a broad audience. So, how'd they do it? Like with the books, you can see it at work through some smart metaphors. Early in the first film, we see how mutants are rejected by family and friends. We hear from Professor X.
The students are mostly runaways, frightened, alone.
Early on, the film introduces Rogue, a mutant who runs away from home after her powers start to manifest. And we don't know for sure that her family threw her out, but we also never see them come look for her. That's a situation a lot of people will recognize. Queer youth experience much higher rates of housing instability, eviction, rejection by caregivers, and the allegory is even closer to the surface in the sequel, X2. Rogue becomes close with Bobby, a character who's since come out as gay in the comics, and when they meet his parents, we see every single trope of a gay coming out scene.
When did you first know you were
a mutant?
Compare that to the indie gay film Get Real, released 5 years earlier.
How long have you known that you're dodgy?
When Bobby comes out as a mutant, his parents wonder who's to blame.
This is all my fault.
Compare that to the coming out scene in Edge of 17.
What did I do wrong? Nothing.
And Bobby's mom asks a question a lot of queer people have heard.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
That's such a common line, it's not even the first time it's been parodied.
Honey, are you sure you're a vampire slayer? I mean, have you tried not being a slayer?
That this is so close to a coming out scene is no accident.
After X2, you know, we called it the coming out scene where Bobby was talking to his parents about being a mutant, so
Yes.
maybe there's a lot more meaning behind that scene.
And here are the filmmakers discussing their intentions.
I think this is something that a lot of people have to go through, you know, whether
Or if
you're gay.
Seeing sort of an allegory of the classic coming out to your parents scene. Except in this case, it goes terribly, terribly, terribly wrong.
And it does go terribly wrong. Like some siblings do, Bobby's brother refuses to accept his brother's difference. He calls the police and triggers a violent confrontation, just because he's heard that mutants are a threat and he believes it. But of course, Bobby isn't dangerous. When we meet him, he's making flower sculptures. The scariest thing he does in front of his family is make iced tea. Like most people, most mutants aren't a threat. They just want to live their lives in peace. But when you're rejected by your own family, what can you do? Well, try to find a place that's safe. And that's what Professor X's school is.
To the public, we're merely a school for gifted youngsters. I protected them, taught them to control their powers, and in time, teach others to do the same. Like your friend Rogue. Here she is, with others her own age, learning, being accepted, not feared.
This is so similar to how queer people make their way to cities and queer enclaves, or if they're teens, to theater camp.
I watched my junior prom from outside in the bushes for 3 hours.
Ooh, that's so Stella Dallas.
That metaphor's been in the comics from the very first issue.
I was surprised at how gentle and nurturing and thoughtful they are about the fantasy of the Xavier School and the fantasy of being held in community. There's a lot of scenes of like Rogue playing pinball, and like the mansion feels like a safe place.
A group of misfits and outcasts who have no place to go. There's this benevolent guy who is just trying to care for everybody. There is so much of that aspect of like, look, we're just over here doing our thing. We really have no interest in infringing upon your lives, your rights, your thing. We're just doing us, and we just want to have the liberty to be us.
And that to me, I think, is an instinct and an impulse that is hard to imagine a blockbuster taking the time for in 2025. If this franchise ever comes back, that is the part I think is most important. It is the part that is the least expensive. My own book, Avengers Academy, is all about this. Like, I like the scenes of characters just hanging out and being friends. I think it was, when I was a kid, my favorite part of the X-Men books, and remains so now.
In the film, Professor X points out how important it is not just to find each other, but to stay hidden.
Anonymity is a mutant's first defense against the world's hostility.
That's a close analog to the real-life anonymity that queer people have often needed, especially pre-Stonewall. The Mattachine Society chose their name as a reference to Mattachinos, performers who hid behind masks. The Daughters of Bilitis chose an intentionally obscure name so that if anyone asked, They could say they were just a poetry group.
What did you think she meant when she mentioned Sappho?
I didn't know. I thought it was a detergent.
And even out in public, queer people have found ways to signal to each other without other people noticing. Like with Polari, British queer slang.
She's been a real boner over. Blowing the groundsels, ling grappling dilly boys, trolling the back slums.
Or with the hanky code.
Yellow one, left side means you give, golden shower. Right side you receive. The red one means...
For mutants in the films, for minorities in real life, sometimes safety depends on not being noticed, because they may face worse threats than simply rejection. In the first 2 X-Men films, we see anti-mutant protests. Marketing for the film included an anti-mutant ad.
Genetically altered mutants are everywhere. No place, not even your own home, is safe. Senator Kelly knows this better than anyone. He stands ready to fight for human preservation.
A central villain is a politician who opposes the very existence of mutants.
Are mutants dangerous?
Compare those protests in the film to real-life protests against queer people.
We do not want our children subjected to this kind of a role model.
To real-life anti-gay ads.
But in San Francisco, when they take to the streets, it's a parade of homosexuals.
And to anti-gay politicians.
Homosexuals do much more than sing, shop, and hold hands. A whole political movement has been created and sustained on a single notion, homosexual sodomy. Even the lowliest of animals do not wittingly conduct themselves in such a manner.
But the scripts don't belabor it. They let the audience notice the connection on their own.
One of the things the metaphor does is, like, you can have Senator Kelly talking about mutant registration or the mutant cure or whatever, and everyone understands what you're talking about in the real world, but you're not constantly re-traumatizing your audience by talking about the very real problems they're facing.
And I think one of the things to Bryan Singer's credit is he was very overt in his filmmaking. In like, the metaphors were really clear. We know what he's putting down. What can we pick up from this?
And Senator Kelly isn't just opposed to mutant existence. He wants to pass laws to force them to register, to be publicly identified. He says it's for everyone's safety.
I think the American people deserve the right to decide whether they want their children to be in school with mutants, to be taught by mutants.
If that sounds familiar, it's because there is a long history of bigots saying similar things about queer people.
Don't we have the right to send our children to school and say that we don't want a homosexual to teach them?
Part of the marketing for the first film included a mock anti-mutant website. If you went to mutantwatch.com, you were encouraged to report mutants to the government. There were articles about the mutant threat, including one about how mutants needed to be identified and regulated because some of them might have an unfair advantage in high school sports. Now, there is a long history of governments maintaining lists of queer people. Sometimes those efforts were ridiculous. In the 1970s, the Navy conducted a lengthy search for gay service members. One investigator heard that gays sometimes referred to themselves as Friends of Dorothy, probably a reference to The Wizard of Oz or the writer Dorothy Parker, but they thought that there was an actual woman named Dorothy, and the Navy spent years trying to find her so they could get her master list of homosexuals. But other cases were a lot more serious. In the 1980s, Reagan advisors wanted mandatory registration of people with HIV.
We want to identify every person who's a carrier. We want to identify every possible way to stop them from spreading the disease.
States passed laws requiring government lists with the names of people who tested positive.
The bill, which allows for criminal prosecution of doctors who fail to turn in the names of people who have AIDS or test positive for the virus. Gay rights groups in Colorado say they will avoid a new AIDS reporting law by setting up clandestine laboratories and using doctors who will not report their names and addresses to the state health department.
This was a terrible idea because it meant there was a strong incentive not to get tested.
You criminalize the conduct, people won't report, people will lie, there will be no capacity to deal with the spread of the disease.
That's why, for a vulnerable group, staying anonymous can be a matter of life and death. And in many cases, it doesn't stop with just lists. In the first X-Men film, Kelly says he just wants to know who the mutants are so people can choose to shun them. That seems bad enough, but in private, he reveals he has a very different goal.
If it were up to me, I'd lock them all away.
That is a brutal line, especially if you know about the Kelly character's lore. In a supplemental special, we learn he has a mutant daughter.
With the support of all genetically pure and patriotic Americans, I can gladly promise you victory over mutants.
It's okay, Daddy. I'm still your little girl.
Kind of unclear what her power is, other than always having a good view at concerts. But even if she's not an official part of the movie, we can still assume Kelly's related to at least some mutants.
There's one in every family, sir. 2 in mine, actually.
And even though Kelly never publicly says what he's planning, Magneto recognizes it. He went through something very similar when he was young, and there's a deleted scene where Magneto confronts Kelly directly.
And trust me when I tell you it's only a matter of time before mutants will be herded into camps, studied for weaknesses, and eventually wiped off the face of the earth.
And even though that scene was deleted, he echoes it in dialogue with Rogue later on.
There is no land of tolerance. There is no peace, not here, nor anywhere else. Women and children, whole families destroyed simply because they were born different from those in power.
And he's not the only one who fears that Kelly's registration could turn into camps. Here's a scene from that special that was made at the same time as the film.
I am most eager to know of any real threat posed to our country, but I also know how my family and thousands of others suffered unjustly from the unfounded hysteria surrounding the Second World War.
She's talking about American concentration camps, which imprisoned tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, most of them US citizens, during World War II. So the idea that government registration and surveillance could lead to arrests and long-term confinement isn't something that these films imagined. It's happened to a lot of groups, including queer people. Back in the 1980s, the calls for mandatory registration for people with HIV evolved into calls for HIV camps.
But more controversial are proposals to find and segregate those exposed to AIDS.
26 million California citizens may be subject to blood tests and possible quarantine.
So in the movies, the concern that mutant registration could lead to mass arrests is another reflection of actual queer experiences. And so is the concern that it won't just stop at arrests. There's an escalation from X-Men 1 to X2. In X-Men 1, the Mutant Registration Act is eventually withdrawn. But there are those who want to operate outside the law. X2 introduces a character named Stryker, an army colonel with a secret military force. Stryker's son Jason is a mutant, and years earlier, he'd sent Jason to Xavier's school hoping that he'd be cured.
You wanted me to cure your son, but mutation is not a disease.
You're lying!
That's another close analog to queer experiences. A lot of parents send their queer kids to camps hoping they can be made straight. Of course, it never works and winds up causing more harm. And for more about that, check out my video about the movie But I'm a Cheerleader.
I myself was once a gay.
Stryker's plan is to harness Xavier's power and kill every mutant on Earth. A genocide. This is exactly what Magneto warned about in the first film.
What would you have me do, Charles? I've heard these arguments before.
That it wouldn't stop with dehumanizing. It would lead to tracking.
Let them pass that law and they'll have you in chains with a number burned into your forehead.
Detention, and then...
eventually wiped off the face of the earth.
They're talking about mutants, but the metaphor is something that humanity has faced many times, against many groups, including queer people. Most notably, they were among those rounded up in World War II. But other countries have imposed the death penalty on people found to be queer. In the UK, homosexuality was punishable by death until the 1860s. In parts of the US, until the 1870s. And as of just a few years ago, Chechnya was rounding up gays into concentration camps where they were tortured and many killed. So behind the fictional story about mutants and sci-fi gadgets, there is a deadly serious allegory about how easy it is for a country to go from dehumanizing, to tracking, to locking people up, to wiping them out. Magneto calls it, and it is chilling how people don't believe him until it may be too late. So can that cycle of violence be stopped? Well, fundamentally, the first 2 X-Men films ask, in the face of bigotry, is there a right way to respond? One possible response is Xavier's, creating a refuge, a shared community, hiding if necessary, and then directing that community to prove its worth so you can negotiate for coexistence. Magneto's approach is more aggressive. He believes the only solution to a human threat is to stand up and demand change. Magneto's mutants are the ones who can't hide. They're visibly different. And even if they could blend in...
Why not stay in disguise all the time? Look like everyone else.
Because we shouldn't have to.
Once again, this is a pretty good metaphor for a division in real-life queer liberation. In the 1950s and 60s, Xavier's was the dominant approach. It was so dangerous to be out, so when queer people did make themselves known, which was rare, they were careful to dress conservatively. Men in suits, women in dresses. They didn't shout, they handed out pamphlets. They were all on their best behavior. And while that might seem limiting, consider the time. Homosexuality was a crime, considered a mental illness. Authorities were just waiting for an excuse to crack down, and often did. Taking a careful approach meant that those early organizers could connect with each other, build their networks with the least amount of disruption. And then, when the time came to step things up, they were ready. After Stonewall, the first Pride protests were organized through the same networks that had been built up over the last few years. And through the 70s and 80s, activism changed. Instead of calm protests, activists invaded offices. Instead of negotiating nicely,
plague! We are in the middle of a fucking plague!
Instead of getting permits, they shut down traffic, the stock exchange.
They have been ignoring us all these years, and the only way you get attention from them is to hit them where it hurts.
And instead of hiding, activists went looking for attention. Like when Senator Jesse Helms voted against HIV research because he said gays were morally weak, a gay group declared him more dangerous than a virus and put a giant condom over his house. So between the suit and tie approach and the confrontational approach, neither one was right or wrong. They were effective in different ways, at different times, especially when they coordinated with each other.
While the demonstration and arrests were orchestrated, there was a surprise. Most drivers caught in the tie-up didn't blow a gasket.
I sympathize with these people. I think they should get more money.
I'm inconvenienced, but I guess there are a lot of other people who have more serious problems that are inconvenienced even worse, huh?
And for more about why that worked so well, check out my video about Zaps in the 1970s. Now, there have always been fights about which approach to favor, and that division is what interested Ian McKellen in the films in the first place.
So they have to decide, are they going to take the Xavier line, which is to somehow assimilate and stand up for yourself, but be proud of what you are, but get on with everybody, or are you going to take the alternative view, which is, if necessary, use violence to stand up for your own rights? And that's true. I'd come across that division within the gay rights movement.
Because this is a Hollywood blockbuster, we need someone to be right and someone to be wrong, so both X-Men films tipped their hands to make Magneto the bad guy. In the first one, his speech about being rounded up and exterminated, which is entirely correct, was taken out and replaced with this.
I've always thought of God as a teacher, as a bringer of light.
Bringer of light is an allusion to the biblical light bringer, Lucifer. And in the second film, we see Magneto dehumanizing the humans.
You are a god among insects. Never let anyone tell you different.
And ultimately, he attempts a genocide of his own.
Still fighting the good fight. From here, it doesn't look like they're playing by your rules. Maybe it's time to play by theirs.
So between them, it seems like Xavier must be right and Magneto must be wrong. But there's no denying Magneto was right about where the bigotry would lead. And Xavier seems to realize that there is value in Magneto's approach. At the end of X2, Xavier and the X-Men invade the Oval Office and confront the president. They say it's not a threat.
Mr. President, this is not a threat. This is an opportunity.
But it sure looks threatening. Xavier even brings with him the mutant who tried to assassinate the president at the start of the film. And they issue what is clearly a warning.
We're here to stay, Mr. President. The next move is yours. We'll be watching.
This is a huge change from where Xavier was at the start of the movies. Initially a pacifist who just watched unnoticed, now he's making a show of force, letting the president know that if humans declare war on mutants, it won't end well for the humans. So even though it might look like Xavier wins, Magneto loses, we also see Xavier shift. Magneto shows him there are times when negotiation doesn't work because your opponent has moved on from negotiating. That's a shift a lot of movements have had to make. Sometimes meeting and compromises work, and sometimes you have to go bigger. So while this is all very interesting as a collection of historical allegories and meditations on activist theory, it seems like it would be a terrible focus for a mainstream blockbuster summer release. And that's on top of it being in a genre that's been discounted from a comic book company known for cinematic bombs, and an action movie with two lead actors in their 60s, and another lead actor who until this point was best known for Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. So nobody had high hopes for an X-Men film. And in the pre-premiere press, You can see how desperate the actors are to explain this isn't like other comic book movies. Really, we promise.
And it is a very, very serious movie.
I think that this movie is a lot sort of smarter and has a lot more sort of thematically going on behind it than your average comic book movie, and
it's set against a much more realistic background. So that's what sets it apart from, the previous genre movies of this kind.
Even Kevin Feige, an associate producer on the first film, had his doubts. He kept thinking about how everyone considered Batman and Robin 2 years earlier the nail in the coffin of the genre. Feige said his great fear was, well, that's the end of that, in terms of movies based on comic books. And it's possible the X-Men films would prove that fear correct. So, the film came out July 14th, 2000, with a modest premiere on Ellis Island, and some interesting choices for entertainment at the after-party. And a few days later, when they got the box office numbers, the X-Men had blasted through the previous record for a summer release. 54 million on its first weekend, well on its way to 300 million worldwide. It was the number 3 movie of the year, behind Mission Impossible 2 and The Grinch. This was a tremendous vindication for everybody who'd spent so long trying to find the right way to make this film.
I wrote the thing in 1963, and everybody says, isn't it great, you got it now? And I said, what took so long?
And of course, they rushed towards production on a sequel, and another, and another, and another, and another. The success of X-Men and X2 cleared a path for the start of a whole cinematic universe based on Marvel characters. And it led to Marvel financing its own movies instead of licensing them to studios that didn't understand the source. Also, many of the people who worked on those first 2 X-Men films helped establish what became the MCU. David Hayter, who worked on the first Iron Man film. Kevin Feige now oversees the entire cinematic universe. And of course, Stan Lee is omnipresent. Now, not everybody stuck around. Bryan Singer stepped away from the films. In recent years, he's faced accusations of abuse and unsafe conditions on sets. That's very disappointing. But even without him, the inclusion of queer themes and characters has continued, and even expanded. Whether it's subtext, like in X-Men First Class, which screenwriter Zack Stentz said had very intentional queer allegories.
We are different, but we shouldn't be trying to fit into society. Society should aspire to be more like us. Mutant and proud.
And with openly queer characters like Morph in X-Men 97. Here's Morph's voice actor, JP.
We're never ultra overt about Morph's identity. We never have the very special, I'm non-binary episodes. Like the original X-Men movies, we didn't have to say anything overtly for everybody who was queer to pick up on it and be like, oh my God, this is mine. This belongs to me. I think I love Morph so much because of their impact and because of what the X-Men represents as a whole, especially right now, as a team of outcasts who, despite being reviled by society, still choose to fight for society and fight for a better world and keep coming back in the face of adversity.
And more important than the box office is the impact that these stories had.
It provided a metaphor for talking about issues with my friends and issues in larger spaces about like queer acceptance, disability acceptance. Like it let a bunch of kids in a Catholic all-boys school have a way to think about difference that was counter to the narratives we were receiving as a kid. I think that it gave me a framework for coming out in a lot of ways. I'm not wrong just because the authority figures in my life say I'm wrong.
At a time when no mainstream blockbuster film was ever going to focus on queer themes, the X-Men managed to show millions of people a coming out scene. A story about
Gosh darn it.
a vulnerable minority. A warning about the danger of dehumanizing others, and examples of how to fight back against bigotry. All with fun action and snappy dialogue. It is incredible that a blockbuster film could do all that, but if any was going to do it, it makes sense that it would be the X-Men. As Stan himself said, as fantastic as comic book stories are, they're always a reflection of the real world.
That world may change and evolve, but the one thing that will never change is the way we tell our stories of heroism. Those stories have room for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, religion, or color of their skin. We're all part of one big family, the human family, and you're part of that family that moves ever upward and onward to greater glory. In other words, Excelsior.
Now, there is a lot more to say about the X-Men. There's the story of how Hugh Jackman replaced the guy they wanted to play Wolverine, and how Tom Cruise helped get Ian McKellen cast as Magneto. Plus, more details about that never-produced, bonkers 1984 X-Men that climaxes in a tickle fight, and how the comics industry was transformed by a psychiatrist who mistook Batman and Robin for a secret gay couple. I'm posting all those stories and lots more in videos over on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/MattBaum. Huge thanks to Anthony and JP for chatting with me for this video. Check out my full conversations with both of them in video and podcast form. There's links to all that in the description. And thanks to Emma from the channel Media Processing for the edit on this video. Click the link on screen or in the description to check out her channel. And now, if you'll excuse me, it's time for the next stage in human evolution.
What the hell? There's a sound. Why can't I hear the sound? Oh. I've been disconnected.
And games, where do we even... If tomorrow morning you woke up and the entire world randomly decided to take you out and everyone is gunning for you and you could only choose one guy to back you up, who would it be? No magic, no superpowers, no sci-fi stuff, just raw brute strength. We're talking the single toughest, meanest, most hardcore, overall just baddest person you can think of. Well, hands down for me, I'm picking Conan the Unstoppable, Beastly, and Legendary Barbarian. Because after he's crushed your enemies to pieces, seen them driven before you, you know that he'll be kicking back, drinking with you, and enjoying the sweet, sweet sounds of the lamentations of their women. Now, even though we all know that Conan is awesome, here's the thing. People seriously underestimate just how massive and insane the entire Conan series is. Sure, when you hear Conan, you probably think of buff Arnold flexing in the 80s, and maybe some comic book heads among you might think of the Marvel runs, and even for the hardcore fans, they know about Robert Howard's original stories all the way back from the 1930s, but trust me when I say all of that is barely scratching the surface. This series has been around for nearly a century and is an absolute monster. We're talking D&D crossovers, French art films, and crazy other adaptations that no one talks about, and that is literally the tip of the iceberg. In fact, I'd bet that even die-hard Conan fans haven't heard of half the wild stuff we're going to get into today. And for those rare souls among you who do know every single thing I'm going to mention in this video today, well, you 100% get a gold star from Crom himself. But I think all of this speaks to the larger point of the sheer influence Conan has had, not just on one time period, but generation upon generation, decade upon decade. So in this video, I'm going to explore the origins of Conan all the way back in the 30s, the insane and incredibly convoluted history of the books, comics, and mini adaptations over the years, and finally try to put it all together and understand what it all means to understand whatever happened to Conan the Barbarian. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I just want to give a huge shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. You guys are the best. So, with a series as massive as Conan, spanning nearly a century of books, comics, movies, and games, where do we even begin? Well, the best place to start is where the title suggests, with Conan himself. But we have to ask the deceptively simple question, well, who actually is Conan? Now, most people have at least a rough idea of who Conan is, and if you ask some random person on the street what comes to mind, they probably think of this hulking, sword-wielding brute with muscles for days, right? But the reality is that it's not that simple at all, because while Conan is just one character, he's been portrayed in so many different ways across the many decades. There's the Marvel Comics version, the 80s Arnold version, and of course the original Conan from Robert E. Howard's 1930s stories. And these are the ones that truly set the groundwork for everything that followed. Howard's Conan is intelligent, charismatic, and always one step ahead of everyone else. He's often described as a force of nature, more animal than man. It's his instincts and reflexes that really set him apart. Howard quite often compares him to panthers, moving quietly but with immense force and precision behind each step. Conan's basically the type of guy who can walk into a room and immediately just completely own it without even trying. We're talking about universe-sized BD energy here. One of my favorite examples that really sums this up is from the story The Black Stranger. Conan doesn't even show up until pretty much halfway through the story, and it's in the middle of this tense standoff between dangerous and ruthless people, and Conan just kind of strolls into the standoff like it's no big deal after casually scaling the walls of the fort, and instantly he just takes over the scene. He commands the room with nothing but his presence, surrounded by people who love nothing more than to kill him. But instead of being nervous, he laughs, cracks jokes, and takes control of the situation without breaking a sweat. He knows he's in charge, and everyone else falls into line willingly or not. And that's part of the reason why Conan is so compelling. He's this perfect mix of primal power and sharp instinct. He's not just a barbarian who gets by on brute strength. He's also got way more intelligence and cunning than most people give him credit for. In one instance, he's confronted by this massive, terrifying dragon for the first time in his life, and his companion is understandably terrified. But Conan, well, he just watches it, calm, calculating, and instantly can read the dragon's emotions from the tiniest details and movements. Conan is as cool as a cucumber. Cucumber Conan. Terrible joke. Anyway, one of the best things about this is that we get to see Conan in so many different roles and situations. He's constantly shifting, whether you call them professions or not, I don't know, but he's been everything. A thief, a pirate, a mercenary, and of course a king, although just for a short spell. Conan was literally born on a battlefield, and from that moment onward, it's been a whirlwind of raiding, traveling, and fighting anything or anyone that gets in his way. From the icy peaks of Samaria to the jungles of Kush, he's faced everything from savage warriors to eldritch horrors, and you can best believe none of them faze him. Gods, monsters, it's all the same to Conan. And what's amazing is that he's not doing this all for some grand overarching goal or for wealth. More often than not, he's just driven by wanderlust, or because he blew all of his money, or running from the people trying to throw him in jail. You just get a sense like he is all about this life. Sure, he might save up a massive treasure by the end of one story, but by the start of the next, he's blown it all on booze and chicks. My man is living for the thrill of it. But even though he can come off as a bit of a rogue or a mercenary, it's important to say that he does operate on his own code of honor. Conan's ethics might be brutal, but they're consistent. He has no problem with stealing or killing when necessary, but he's honest, and this is a huge part of what makes Conan Conan. So to give you a better sense of all of this, let's take it straight from the man himself. I seek not beyond death. Let me live while I live. Let me know the rich juices of red meat and stinging wine on my palate, the hot embrace of white arms, the mad exultation of battle when the blue blades flame in crimson. And I am content. Let teachers and philosophers brood over questions of reality and illusion. I know this: if life is illusion, then I am no less an illusion, and being thus the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, and am content. And this is all even cooler when you realize that Conan doesn't really have any superpowers. At the end of the day, he's just a dude. What really sets him apart is this unique blend of sheer will, savagery, and cunning. But of course, we cannot overlook his iconic and just sheer physicality. And even Conan's creator, Howard, seemed a little obsessed with Conan's body, with constant phrases describing his, quote, corded muscles and, quote, steely thews, which I wish someone would say to describe me. But anyway, it's hard to ignore that Howard had a bit of hero worship going on with Conan, and honestly, who didn't? He's awesome. But you really see this come out in quotes like this one from Howard himself when a reporter asked him who Conan was. Conan is the there ever was. He's got a long black mane of hair and crystal blue eyes. He's a fighter, born on the battlefield. To him, combat's a way of life. It's all he's ever known, all he ever wants to know. But he's no soldier who's taught to fight. To him, fighting's an instinct. It's a part of him, like his legs, his arms, his chest, his bull neck. And believe me, he don't take it from nobody. He'll fight man, beast, devil, or god. And when those women feel those tree trunk firm arms around their waist, they melt like butter on a hot skillet. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Howard. Okay, so for those of you who have not melted like a butter on a hot skillet, let's continue, because we can't fully understand Conan without diving into the world that he lives in, because these two are inseparable. Now, it wasn't until I personally got older and I truly realized how complex and frankly staggeringly vast Robert E. Howard's world building is. There's literally tens of thousands of years of history and lore woven into this world, and we have to remember that Howard did all of this way back in the 30s for a so-called pulp character. This level of world building was absolutely groundbreaking. In fact, I recently saw an interview with George R.R. Martin where he was talking about his world building and inspiration for it, and he made a point of referencing Conan alongside Middle-earth as inspirations for him. And speaking of Tolkien, he was actually a bit of a fan of Conan too, and I think all of this really goes to show that although Howard does get a lot of credit for the creation of Conan, one of the most influential and important aspects of Conan was creating a blueprint for world building and fantasy that led directly to things like The Lord of the Rings. All of that massive and layered thousands of years worth of world building we've come to expect from stories started with Howard and his insanely detailed Hyborian Age. Alright, so what exactly is this world? Well, the Conan stories are technically set on the Earth, but not the Earth we'd recognize today. It's this mythical era that Howard created called the Hyborian Age. Howard himself described it as, quote, between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities and the years of the rise of the sons of Eris. To Howard, civilization came in three distinct cycles. First was the Thurian Age, a time when Atlantis reigned as a powerful empire. Next came the Hyborian Age, which was Conan's era, full of brutal kingdoms and untamed wilderness. Finally, we have our own modern civilization. Each of these ages was divided by a Stone Age, the aftermath of some catastrophic global events that nearly wiped the slate clean, forcing humanity to start over. Now, there are literally tens of thousands of years of lore and entire other characters like Kull and other world building I glossed over, but what's important is that it's a world rebuilt after Cataclysm, full of kingdoms, monsters, and sorcery. Basically the perfect playground for a guy like Conan. It's a world that feels ancient but somehow timeless. Imagine something like a wild mix between Dark Sun and Game of Thrones, a savage, brutal land full of warriors, barbarians, sorcerers, and monsters, but with this raw, untamed energy that keeps it alive. And here's the thing, Howard was obsessed with history, and it shows. It's all over his world building. He wanted that epic historical vibe, but without being tied down to real-world rules. So by creating this vanished age, he didn't have to deal with annoying anachronisms or endless fact-checking. But it wasn't all about taking shortcuts. Howard was so in love with foreign cultures and history that he built his own world from the ground up. He just couldn't stop himself. You get the sense that he felt like he had to do it. He was obsessed. In interviews, he describes how writing Conan, it felt like Conan was right there with him, axe in hand, and if he didn't get the story right, Conan would split his head open with an axe. And that worked like magic. The world's history is baked into the background, and there's never this long, boring exposition in the books themselves. Howard just throws you into this world full of ancient, crumbling civilizations and long-lost non-human empires, and I just cannot overstate how much this adds to the awesomeness of the books, with this subtle world building just giving an unexpected but totally welcome level of depth. What's also fascinating about this world is the mix of different technology levels. You have knights in shining armor battling against tribes wielding flint weapons. Conan's world is this interesting mashup of technologies ranging from the Stone Age to the late Steel Age, all just coexisting together. As far as geography, it's an entire world with kingdoms inspired by India, China, and Native American culture. And in that vein, all of these were inspired by real-life cultures. For example, Aquilonia resembles medieval France, Corinthia draws from ancient Greece, and another standout example of Howard's creativity are the Picts, which he crafted as a combination of various different cultures, including Native Americans, African, and Pacific influences. Now, these parallels really do highlight Howard's passion for history, but it's essential to remember that the world is low fantasy at its core, and it's more than just kingdom and politics. The Conan stories are filled with gods, magic, vampires, and dragons, but it's important to say that these supernatural elements are often in the background. Magic is rare, and non-human races tend to live in remote, untamed areas most people avoid. Now, what's also interesting is that these gods and monsters are very Lovecraftian in a way that they kind of transcend typical human life, and this does make complete sense because although they never met, Howard and Lovecraft were actually avid correspondents and very good friends. And it's really interesting to think that Tolkien, Lovecraft, and Howard all kind of knew each other and were pulling influences from one another. So I've talked a lot about Howard, but like Conan, we have to ask, who actually is he? Well, Robert E. Howard was a fascinating guy, as you might imagine. Born in 1906, he was a Texan whose life was shaped by the raw, untamed frontier of the time. Howard came up with the Conan character while exploring southern Texas, indulging in the, quote, wholesale consumption of tortillas, enchiladas, and cheap Spanish wine. Now, it's worth noting that Howard was not really social, and he had a lot of anxiety in social situations, especially with the independent and rough type of people who lived in Texas at the time. But these people he encountered there, especially those working in the oil fields, undoubtedly played a huge role in crafting the Conan character. Some people even kind of view Conan as the man Howard himself wishes he could have been. Confident, bold, and commanding of situations, but this blending of rugged individualism with a deep appreciation of history all comes out in one of the main themes of the Conan stories, which is, of course, civilization versus barbarism. Through Conan, Howard paints civilization as a fragile veneer over humanity's primal instincts. If you've ever played the game Civilization, you might think of progress as a pretty straight line, from wheels to future tech, but Howard would definitely disagree. He viewed civilization as something on a sliding scale where they might rise and fall and teetering between the heights of culture and the depths of barbarism. Quote, "Barbarism is the natural state of mankind, civilization is unnatural, and barbarism must always ultimately triumph." To Conan, the veneer of civilization is a flimsy facade, a mask worn by those who lack the courage and integrity to face reality. He sees right through the false smiles, empty platitudes, and elaborate rituals that only serve to hide the darker truths of human nature. He basically has little patience for society's BS. Now, when it comes to the writing itself, Howard's prose has aged surprisingly well. Well, with some parts, we'll talk about that. But as far as the writing, it's filled with just this vigor and adverbs, and he really excels at summing up and describing characters without a ton of words. His storytelling aligns more with modern fantasy than you might think, blending vivid action with intricate world building. The writing is punchy and visceral, pulling you right into the heart of the battle alongside Conan. It's all fast-paced with brutal action standing in stark contrast to the often meandering tone of some other fantasy works, although Howard does get dragged for prose usage. You get a sense that Howard was right there in the thick of the action next to Conan, and you can't help but imagine how much further Howard would have evolved the Conan series if he had lived longer, which, spoilers, Anyway, Howard's writing practically crackles with adventure, and you can really feel his enthusiasm and passion for it in every word, even if he wasn't the most technically skilled writer. But let's be real, while Conan is a powerful and enduring work, it's not without its flaws. Some of those early stories come off as a bit formulaic, sprinkled with campy moments and predictable plots. Plus, there's an undeniable presence of what we in today's world would view as sexism and racism. Howard often uses stereotypes and a lot of skin color adjectives, and it's clear he had a different worldview born from his time, and we have to remember that he did grow up in the Jim Crow South, which clearly shaped his perspective. But if you do dig around in other of Howard's writings, particularly his letters, you're definitely gotta find some pretty distasteful stuff. Still, despite the criticism, Conan endures as a landmark work in fantasy literature. And the groundwork that Howard laid here with this original incarnation of Conan is undeniable, with a massive appeal that has lasted decade after decade. And I think the real charm of Conan lies in this grim, violent world, which basically says we're all doomed, but how we face that doom is what really matters. Do you spit in its eye and go down swinging, or do you let it consume you? And I think this was really appealing to audiences at the time. We have to remember that Conan was born during the Great Depression in America, a time when trust in institutions was at an all-time low and people were grappling with economic collapse and social upheaval. And Conan's journey from thief to king resonated with that sense of uncertainty, and he pretty much embodied self-reliance and individual strength at a time when many people felt completely powerless. And that's not even to mention the sheer masculinity of Conan. I mean, he is the original Giga Chad. But for whatever the reason, the character and the themes woven throughout Conan's adventures, the clash between civilization and barbarism, the corrupting nature of power, and the cyclical rise and fall of empires would see Conan's popularity grow and just keep on growing. So if all this talk of monsters and magic has you in the mood for some tabletop or gaming action, you might be interested in checking out today's sponsor, Dice Emporium. They have a gigantic selection of dice. Seriously, every single type you could possibly want. One of the best things is that they offer not only 7-piece D&D sets, but also a massive amount of individual dice. So basically, if you just need one more for your favorite set that maybe you've lost, this is the perfect place to look. I'm happy to support these guys, so if you're interested, check out the link in the description below. Alright, so I think we all know that Conan himself is kind of a legend and the world building is really cool. So let's all enjoy this brief moment of simplicity, because from here on out, things are going to get messy. Why? Well, because we need to dive into what actually makes up the Conan series, and honestly, I've been dreading this part because it's insane how much material there actually is. Think of any form of media. Conan's been there, and odds are it's been done more than once across different timelines by different creators, re-releases, and yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So I'm gonna try my best here, and I think the only place to start is with the thing that kicked it all off in the first place, which are the original books by Robert Howard. So Howard sold a number of these Conan stories to various magazines, including Weird Tales and Fantasy Fan, between 1932 and 1936. Conan the Barbarian, as we know and love him, first appeared in Weird Tales back in 1932, and it's interesting because it really seemed like Howard didn't initially plan for Conan to be a long-running character. The first story to feature Conan was the Phoenix on the Sword, and that was actually written for one of Howard's other characters, King Kull. But the key themes we now associate with Conan, barbarism versus civilization,
Hey, anyone in here?
action, it was all in there. And you can tell that Howard got hooked because he wrote 2 more Conan stories straight after, and then
If anyone's in here, say hi.
essay fleshing out the world in more detail. We're talking maps, deep lore, the whole thing. And again, keep in mind that this was for pulp fiction, which by its nature is more action-packed stories. So the fact he went the extra thousands of miles to write truly unprecedented levels of lore for this just is kind of remarkable and shows you the type of passion he must have had for this. Now, what I find even more fascinating about this era is that Howard wrote Conan in starts and stops, with bursts of inspiration, then losing interest. And actually, in just a couple of years, he had seemingly moved on from the character and wanted to write westerns instead. But it is important to note here that that at the end of the day, Howard was just trying to find work, and more often than not, he was just trying to find different ideas that would sell. But coming back to Conan and putting this all in perspective, this really all just amounts to a couple handful of years of work by Howard on Conan. And this small amount of time was the groundwork for a series that would resonate across generations, and everything else from the comics, the movies, and other adaptations draw directly from these original Howard books. You got the classics like The Tower of the Elephant and Red Nails, and again, this just set the stage for everything that followed. So after Howard's death in 1936, the Conan series found itself in a bit of a limbo, but the first hardcover collection of Howard's Conan stories was released by Gnome Press. Eventually, L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter were entrusted to flesh out, revise, and write additional Conan material, and in 1967, de Camp helped launch a paperback series through Lancer Books. Now, this was a significant moment for the series because I think Conan as a whole would have very easily died if it hadn't been for this collection of books, because it reintroduced Howard's story to an entire new generation and set the stage for the surge of popularity with the movie that would release in the 80s. Lancer eventually folded in 1973, and Ace Books took over, reprinting the earlier volumes and continuing to release an additional book. The idea behind the Lancer books was to collect all published Conan material up to that point. Before that, it had all been scattered all over the place. Now, these Lancer/Ace books are a bit controversial because de Camp wasn't content with just re-releasing Howard's original works. Oh no, he wanted to create new stories that were a combination of already complete Howard story fragments, and opinions on de Camp's involvement are mixed to say the least. Some fans appreciate the way he kept the series alive, but others felt the quality of the new work was inconsistent with Howard's original vision. It's understandable considering the nature of this Frankenstein approach, basically piecing together Howard's outlines, fragments, and unrelated stories and blending them in with de Camp's own ideas. It's worth noting though that despite the mixed reception to de Camp, he did at least try to stay true to the spirit of Howard's work, and he himself was a huge fan of the original series. Now, things get even messier for Conan between the 70s and 80s, and this era is really kind of the Wild West for Conan books. You've got limited edition illustrated versions of Howard's stories from Donald M. Grant, which themselves would quickly fizzle out. Then there were re-releases of Howard's original text from Berkeley Books, and these editions openly criticized the Lancer Ace books. There's actually a bit of a gray area here because in these Berkeley editions, they didn't even have the proper rights to Conan because they were eventually halted by de Camp himself. Now, if that all wasn't enough for you, at this same time you had reprints and supplements from the Lancer Ace versions floating around, so this period was really all over the place with different editions and publishers from Spear to Bateman to Mardo, all competing to release Conan stories. But luckily for the Conan series, and for people like me trying to not lose their mind piecing together this insane timeline of hundreds of different publishers, things got a lot more cohesive in the 80s thanks to our boy Arnold and his Conan the Barbarian movie, which don't worry, we'll talk about much more later. Anyway, as soon as Conan became this money-making machine, the book side of things quickly followed, and as you might imagine, Tor Publishing started cranking out Conan stories left and right. Now, I think a lot of people kind of skip over these books in favor of Howard or the Ace Lance ones, but there were a ton of books here. Now, I think the reason that these do get skipped over is because the quality of the writing varies a lot, and some of these stories had a reputation for not feeling very Conan-esque at all. But there were some pleasant surprises in here, and one thing that really surprised me personally was finding out that Robert Jordan wrote some of these. Yes, that Robert Jordan, you know, the guy behind The Wheel of Time. Okay, but let's not get too distracted with side quests because in the 2000s, we finally got what's probably the most definitive collection of Conan stories out there. And honestly, it's what I would recommend to everyone if you're just trying to cut through all this noise and find the good stuff. I'm talking about the Complete Chronicles of Conan from 2006. This edition contains all of Robert Howard's original Conan stories exactly as he wrote them. This is the Conan Bible, baby. But actually, that wasn't even it for the 2000s, because of course it wasn't. We saw a handful of other illustrated Howard editions by Wandering Star, and even entire trilogies based on the MMORPG Age of Conan, which, trust me, again, we'll talk about later. Oh, and speaking of tie-ins, 2011 gave us some movie tie-in books to the 2011 Momoa movie, which again, we'll talk about later. later. Now, we're going to circle back to what's happening with the series today, including some of the newer books later in this video, but wow, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that considering most people don't even realize Conan started as a book series, the sheer number of Conan books and publishers over the years is truly staggering. I've been neck deep in Conan research for weeks, and I still can't say with certainty just how many books there even are, but it's probably easily in the hundreds between all the different authors, re-releases, special editions, and that's not even getting into the Polish or Russian editions, which, by the way, there's a Russian Conan series with alone over 40 volumes. It's honestly mind-blowing. But again, I think it really goes to show the enduring appeal of the series. And what's even crazier is that we're already 20 or 30 minutes into this video, and we haven't even talked about the Conan comics yet. So yeah, buckle up. But if you think the comic book side of things is going to be any less confusing or convoluted than the books, well, I admire your optimism, but life is about to slap you down because the comics are just as chaotic with sub-series, miniseries, and random one-offs sprinkled throughout the timeline. So while it might look straightforward on the surface, we're diving into some deep, tangled waters, but we'll go through these one by one and we'll be fine, I promise. Now, it's impossible to even begin talking about the Conan comics without mentioning the man, the legend, Roy Thomas. It's kind of insane because it was almost a miracle that Conan ended up at Marvel in the first place. Marvel at the time was a pretty small company, and fans had been asking for comic adaptations of pulp heroes like Tarzan and John Carter. Marvel didn't think they would be able to afford a character as big as Conan, so they were actually aiming for something smaller, but on a bit of a whim, they decided to pitch to the right holders for Conan, and they ended up going for it for $200 an issue. Now, Marvel was real hesitant at first because this was pretty pricey for them, but the gamble paid off and Conan became a massive hit. Now, Roy Thomas not only wrote the stories from Howard's original tales, but he even expanded upon them, building out the worlds even further, and it was for this reason another iconic character was born. I'm of course talking about Red Sonja. Now, she was loosely based on Howard's earlier Red Sonja, although that original character was actually part of a story set during an Ottoman Turkish siege. Now, in the comics, Red Sonja's backstory was revamped. Her family was killed and she was abused by mercenaries. She prayed to the gods for strength, and they granted it on the condition that she would never sleep with a man unless that man could defeat her in combat. Now, like Conan, she would go on to get her own comic series and eventually movie. But like with all things Conan, it's easy to get sidetracked by all the different spin-offs and collections, so let's stay focused for now. The Marvel era of Conan really took off in a big way, and it's hard to imagine we'd ever have gotten the 1982 movie without it. But what truly solidified Conan's place in comic history was the Savage Sword of Conan in 1974. Now, this black and white magazine is considered the peak of Conan's comic legacy. When people think of Conan comics, this is often the series they're thinking about. Now, what made Savage Sword so special was that it wasn't bound by the Comics Code Authority, since it was technically labeled a magazine and not a comic, so that means it didn't have to conform to the censorship guidelines. It could dive into darker, grittier territory. We're talking about nudity, intense violence, and all that raw Conan good stuff. And this all made it much closer to Howard's original vision. If you've seen any of these incredible covers, you know just how striking the art actually was. Now, Marvel kept Savage Sword running for almost 2 decades, which says a lot about its impact. It brought Conan to a whole new generation of fans, and it's probably the closest any comic has come to capturing that raw, primal power of Howard's writing. If you're just getting into Conan, this is definitely the series to start with. Now, it's important to realize that fantasy comics kind of faded in popularity in the 90s, and Conan was no exception and lay dormant for almost a decade. But fortunately for everyone, in 2003, Dark Horse Comics picked up the license and ushered in a whole new era. Now, this absolute banger is often considered one of the best, reintroducing Conan with some of the best art and writing the character has seen, and again stayed true to that original Howard vision all the way back in the original stories. And for a lot of fans, the Dark Horse era is where modern Conan really found his footing. Now, sadly, all good things come to an end, and whether it was because of low sales or another reason, Conan started to look a bit like ping pong because Dark Horse dropped it and Marvel reacquired the Conan license in 2018 and launched a new Conan the Barbarian series. Unfortunately, this new run didn't quite hit the mark with some of the hardcore fans, many of whom preferred the darker aesthetic of the Dark Horse years. Then there was a bunch of either fun or ridiculous shenanigans in here depending on your viewpoint, because in 2019, Conan was pulled into the Marvel Universe, fighting alongside characters like Wolverine and Punisher in the Savage Avengers, which to be fair is highly regarded. Now this again was a gamble for Marvel because Conan was a lot different from the other heroes it had during this time, and ultimately, spoilers, it didn't work out, but it is another fascinating piece of history in this incredibly interesting series. Now, Marvel also had its own set of one-shots and mini-series devoted to other Conan characters. Now, at the same time Marvel was trying to revitalize Conan in their own universe, Ablaze Comics was leaving their own mark on the Conan legacy. After a brief legal battle, Ablaze was allowed to publish English translations of a series of comic book adaptations of Howard stories
says hello, sir.
in Europe. Now,
Hello, Mr. Ty. How are you?
two publishers could both be doing Conan comics at the same time.
Everything's okay.
Because Marvel trademarked their specific version.
What about you, sir?
Marvel's own timeline and world building. Now, Ablaze used the older Howard stories as a basis, which at this time were under fair use. Which is confusing, right? Anyway, these Ablaze versions are kind of viewed as mid-tier by some people, but it's worth to note some people enjoyed them because they are straightforward adaptations of the original Howard stories. And anyway, here we are, we finally made it to the modern era of Conan. Titan Comics picks up the Conan mantle in 2023, and I've got to say they've really nailed it so far. Conan feels like Conan, doing all the classic Conan things. And what's even better is that remember how I mentioned Savage Sword was the gold standard for Conan comics? Well, Titan's relaunch of Savage Sword...
Am I coming through okay? Can you hear me?
Uncensored goodness that comes
I hope you can hear me.
The throwback touch of printing it on newspaper. And just so you know, there are literally hundreds of Conan comics out there, different timelines, different authors. So
Art
if you're willing to do a little
underscore
digging,
Ty
you're
says,
bound
yeah,
to
I
find
can hear
something
you.
that suits your taste.
Good, 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 good.
Chaos and
underscore
noise
Ty
over
says
the years,
hello.
there have also been some fun,
Good, 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 good.
facets along the way. Now, I'm sure some diehard
Ty, have you made anything recently? I'd love to see it.
the section that the very first Conan comic wasn't actually in Marvel, but actually published in Mexico in 1952. One of my personal favorite fun facts, though, is that there is a Barack the Barbarian tie-in. And yes, you heard that right. Former President Barack Obama is actually a fan
says,
of
I
Conan
don't think so.
and even collects his comics. And yes, he even made an appearance in
Art underscore
Barack
by
the
underscore
Barbarian,
Ty says, I
published by
haven't
Devil's
painted
Due.
in a month
So yeah,
or so.
bringing this all in, the world
That must not feel so nice, huh?
think. But throughout all the ups and downs, they've definitely been a huge part of what's kept Conan alive, hacking his way through popular culture for decades. Now, what's absolutely insane to me is that even with the hundreds, maybe by this point, thousands of Conan books and comics
Art
out there,
by underscore
Conan
Ty
didn't
says, I
really
am trying
hit
to learn to
mainstream
tattoo.
status until the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Well, of course, because the juggernaut that was Conan the Barbarian
I remember you mentioning that.
came out, and for better or worse, it propelled Conan into pop culture. Now, we have to get a mind for the timing.
Got any of that to show?
Rocked the box office in 1977, Hollywood became obsessed with epic adventures in strange, fantastical lands, and naturally someone noticed that Conan had huge appeal with young male audiences who were snapping up those comics left and right. But even though Conan had money-making potential, getting the movie made was a bit of a nightmare. At the time, the licensing rights were a mess scattered across different
Art underscore
companies,
by
and it's
underscore
honestly
Ty
a
says,
miracle
not really.
that the film
Just
happened
practicing
at all.
the basics.
But to make a long story short, it
What are you practicing on? Those like synthetic skins that people have, or is it like
himself.
Somebody told me to try it on
level there
like chicken skin, chicken legs.
absolute 80s camp gold, if nothing else. The grittiness, minimal dialogue, and of course the absolutely epic music score, as well as the violence,
Art
which we
underscore
have to
by
remember this
underscore
was
Ty
pretty
says
extreme
correct.
violence for the time,
Synthetic skins.
all made it stand out on release and
Cool.
to the current day. And then of course you got James Earl Jones, who was an absolute legend.
Okay, I see you finished the. Wait, hold
Entire presence just being sheer iconic.
on.
Characters in here were great in their own way, with not nearly enough credit going to Valeria. And hey, do you
Last time we spoke, you were making this. It turned out quite nice. I like it.
really just visually stunning with its own unique aesthetic, which I don't ever think will
This looks pretty cool.
And I just have to say one more time,
I like the color variation.
absolutely legendary, really elevating the movie from great.
This looks cool.
It's cheesy, but the
Really spooky.
sword and
These cracks, did you like paint them in or did you like draw them in?
if you don't feel something with the whole all that matters is that
Like this area looks so cool.
then I legitimately don't know what to say other than why do you hate fun? But I think what's really important about this film as far as the history of Conan
Cool.
is that for many people this was their first introduction
Art
to
underscore by
Conan,
underscore
and it's hard
Ty
to
says
knock
they are
something that
painted.
got so many people into the
Cool.
world. That being said, the movie is not without its issues, and the biggest of these is that the movie Conan is not really accurate to Howard's original character. The names and some of the situations are there, but the tone and spirit are totally different at times. Like we went over before, Howard's Conan was pretty cynical of civilization and its many ironies, and was a barbarian through and through. But the Arnie version of Conan isn't really technically a barbarian, because for many of his formative years, he was working in and learned in civilization. And remember when I mentioned how Howard's Conan wasn't just all muscle, but also this precise, intelligent, and charismatic guy? Well, in the film, Arnie is the strong and silent type, which stands as a total contrast to Howard's Conan, who was out there talking trash to his enemy, strategizing with allies, and later even discussing politics. He's a leader, charismatic, quick to assess situations, and knows how to command the energy in a room. He's got this towering presence, not just because of his size, but because he's sharp and confident. Now, I'm not saying that Arnold Conan is dumb or anything, but they definitely scaled back a lot of his lines because Arnold's English wasn't great at the time. So a lot of that nuance, the wits, the strategy, and the depth of the character get a bit lost in translation. Arnold's physically imposing, sure, but he doesn't really quite capture the same presence or natural intelligence that the original Conan had. And this does carry over to the sequel, Conan the Destroyer, in 1984. Now, this one definitely leaned into more typical fantasy genre tropes and veered even further from Howard's original stories. Instead of the gritty, raw Conan tale we got in the first movie, this
So
one
what's new, Ty?
almost playful.
Tell me some stories.
Mismatched characters. It's campier and more over the top, which honestly kind of works if you think of it as capturing the vibe of the early Marvel Conan comics. And fun fact on that note, Quentin Tarantino himself actually prefers this movie over the first one. Now, there were of course plans to make a third film called Conan the Conqueror, but that didn't happen because Arnold was busy filming Predator. Plus, his contract had expired after Red Sonja, which, by the way, was supposed to feature him as Conan, but due to licensing issues, they had to change his character. But really, it's just Conan, come on. But here's the kicker.
Art underscore by underscore Ty says nothing to tell really. Getting evicted from our house, so we're scrambling to find a new place.
Oh geez, I'm so sorry. That sounds terrible.
Conan, and Arnold was all in and apparently super excited about it. But
I'm so sorry.
the project got dropped, although there was still talk.
That's terrible news.
Now, as recently as 2023, Arnold was still teasing it, saying, quote, "I have a deal with Netflix, and when we ask Netflix, they don't know anything about it. It's one of those crazy things. I hope he figures it out." There's a great script out there. The story is there. There are directors who want to do it, but he has the rights, and until he sells the rights for one or two
Art
movies
underscore
or
by
for the
underscore Ty
franchise,
says
there's
it's
nothing
okay.
you can do about
I am ready
now,
for a new
of course,
place.
Conan did not disappear from the big screen after the 80s. In 20
Okay.
Conan the Barbarian with Jason Momoa taking on the iconic role. And honestly, the first sequence, like the very start of the movie from Conan's
The place you're getting evicted from, is it like owned by like a regular like a person, or is it owned by like a corporation or something?
of his enemies to his dad is just like, wow. It's good stuff and captures the character. After that, though, it takes a steep dive. It's a bad movie, there's no doubt about it, but it does have enough great elements to still make it fun. The script was weak, but I do think Momoa's portrayal was much closer to Howard's original vision than Arnold ever was. I mean, he just looks the part with the black hair. The fight choreography was pretty solid too, and the costumes and props were fantastic. And believe it or not,
Art
Conan
underscore by
wasn't
underscore
done
Ty
with
says
film
yes.
after that,
We have
although
a single
maybe
landlord,
it should have been.
but he
She's
is
Conan,
losing the
released
home
in
because of
2023,
financial issues.
is perhaps the
So we must
least
leave.
orthodox
Yeah.
Conan to date. It's a French art house film that is a gender-flipped version of the character. The film featured
Sucks, man. I'm sorry.
actresses playing female Conans at various stages of her life. Now, I'm not one to be overly critical on this
Stuff like that happened to my sister's family in Denmark.
Now, I'm sure there's some deeper meaning and subtle nuances here that I'm missing and might resonate with certain viewers, but for me, it felt like a little bit of a fever dream, and they were putting the Conan name in there purely for shock value. Like, there's not really any connection to the original Howard books or the stories in here. That said, to be fair, it's an abstract interpretation rather than a direct adaptation, and visually, it is pretty interesting. The cinematography does make it stand out, even if the overall concept feels a bit wild and honestly forced to me. But I will say it is interesting to see different interpretations of the Conan character, even if it doesn't land for everyone. But if that's too much for you, we can take a quick break and step back to the simpler times of the 90s. And this had a slew of TV shows, including Conan the Adventurer in 1992, which gave us a fun, family-friendly version of Conan that, let's be real, was one of the least accurate adaptations of Howard's work. This Conan was definitely cleaned up for the kids, far from the brutal, brooding warrior we all know and love. But somehow, despite that kid-friendly vibe, Conan the Adventurer actually kind of worked. It hit this sweet spot between fantasy adventure and children's entertainment, making it surprisingly watchable. And let's not forget, it introduced a whole new generation to the Conan universe, which is kind of amazing. Next up, we got Conan and the Young Warriors in 1994, which was a spin-off of the earlier animated series. If you thought Adventurer was toned down, this one took it even further and leaned even more into the safe, kid-friendly Adventure of the Week format. And probably because of that, it didn't last long, just 13 episodes and poof, that was it. But it wasn't just animation, because we also got a live-action Conan the Adventurer from 1997. Now, if you took one look at this and thought, wait a second, this feels like it's trying to cash in on that Xena, Warrior Princess, and Hercules vibe, well, congratulations, you nailed it. That's exactly what it was doing. But again, it was just a little too lighthearted and missing that grit and edge Conan fans had come to expect. So yeah, it's no surprise it didn't make it past one season. And sadly, and somewhat surprisingly, this was the last Conan TV show ever made. But don't worry, because the Conan series, as you might have seen from this video, is absolutely indomitable and never-ending, and nothing shows this more than the game adaptations, because of course there were game adaptations. One of the earlier ones was Hyborian Gates, which was a collectible card game from 1995 that's now out of print.
Sure, have fun, good luck.
Game set in the Conan universe, and jump forward to 2009 and you've got Age of Conan, the strategy board game. And as recently as 2016, there was a wildly popular Conan board game launched on Kickstarter, which has seen tons of expansions over the years. But it doesn't even stop there, because there's been a bunch of strategy games as well, including Royal Armies of Hyborian Age from 1975. Then what I thought was the most interesting was something called Hyborian War, which is a play-by-mail game. And yeah, you heard that right, play-by-mail. Back in the day, people would mail in their orders.
Thank you for saying that.
Switched to email. In the game, you would control one of the kingdoms using generals, wizards, and more to fight for dominance and issue your orders via mail. And get this, Conan himself showed up as a wandering hero, either helping or wreaking havoc on your plans. But when it comes to role-playing games, Conan really shines. And I mean, the whole setting is a perfect match for D&D style campaigns, right? Well, you better believe D&D noticed, and Conan started popping up in supplements, articles, and books for D&D campaigns throughout the 70s and 80s. Now, eventually, TSR, the company behind D&D, released a whole game centered around Conan, aptly titled Conan the Role-Playing Game in 1985. And I think this move was definitely fueled by the success of the Schwarzenegger movie. But because everything in the Conan series has to be confusing, there are actually two different Conan RPGs, both with the same name. The first one by TSR in 1985, and then another one by Mongoose Publishing in 2004. And guess what? Because it doesn't even stop there. As recently as 2017, we got Conan Adventures in an Age Undreamed Of, bringing a fresh take to the tabletop scene. So yeah, if you're a fan of tabletop, pick your Conan poison of choice, because there is RPG aplenty. So I hope you are not too overwhelmed yet, because we haven't even gotten to the video games, baby, and you best believe we got games galore. Interestingly enough, video games didn't really take off until, you guessed it, the movies. Now, the first one to hit the shelves was Conan Hall of Volta, released in 1984. Now, this was a pretty basic platformer, but hey, it did get the ball rolling. Now, fast forward to 1991, and we got Conan the Mysteries of Time, which was itself an adaptation of a computer game called Myth, History in the Making. So talk about layers of meta with adaptations of adaptations. Now, this game was basically borderline unplayable because the difficulty wasn't just challenging, the controls were terrible and made jumping impossible, which for a platformer made things quite difficult. That same year in 1991, we also saw Conan the Cimmerian, which actually had some really impressive artwork and direction for its time, and was probably the best game in the early 90s period. In the 2000s, we got a couple of third-person action games, both conveniently titled Conan, released in 2004 and 2007. Now, one of the fascinating things about the Conan series as a whole is how it's evolved throughout the different phases and generations, and nowhere is this more evident than in video games, especially with Age of Conan Unchanged, that MMORPG I was talking about from 2008, that many fans still swear by. If you want an excellent deep dive into that game, you absolutely have to check out Josh Strive-Hayes' video on it, who as always does a fantastic breakdown. Now, there are still new releases and updates for this as recently as 2024. Speaking of trends, we also got an iOS game because of course we did, and this was called Conan Tower of the Elephant, coming in around the 2011 film remake. But of course, the biggest video game tie-in of recent years is Conan Exiles, released in 2017. If you've ever heard of Ark, you know what I'm talking about. It's a survival game with an impressive world, decent combat, and it's just a blast to roam around in the Conan world. Then in 2019, we got Conan Unconquered, which is a real-time strategy game, which was actually developed by the original team behind Command & Conquer, which was super interesting for me to learn. Now, finally, the most recent game we have is Conan Chop Chop, which definitely has its own unique Conan style, I guess, which has not been done before. It's a charming little co-op roguelike. Now, all of this doesn't even touch on the Roblox games and all other sorts of strange gems I might have missed, like an AI Conan game on the Conan official website. It's honestly all pretty endless. And speaking of other adaptations, I haven't even scratched the surface of the staggering amount of tie-in merchandise that's out there, from quirky items like a Thulsa can opener to all kinds of collectibles. And again, it's a testament to the incredible staying power of Conan. So, bringing all of this together about all the different adaptations, what I personally find charming about it is that no matter what you're into, there is a Conan thing for you. Love cartoons? Well, there's a Conan for you. Into survival games? There's a Conan for you. Into MMORPGs? No problem. The Conan universe really does have something for everyone. Okay, so I think it's safe to say that Conan's journey through pop culture has been nothing short of a wild ride. And guess what? It looks like there are literally no signs of stopping. Now, as far as shows and movies, while a Netflix series was once in the works, it has been shelved, leaving fans buzzing with speculations about a potential for a new film. Now, this movie project has been bounced around from Amazon to Netflix and is currently without a home, but that has not dimmed excitement for what might come of it. In the meantime, though, we've still got the classic good stuff with Titan Comics, which is keeping the Conan flame alive, with fresh comics and reprints that stay true to the original Howard's version. They got a ton of new releases coming up, and I'll link these specific upcoming releases in the description below if you're curious. Now, what really blows my mind about Conan is how massive it's become. Every time I thought I found every nook and cranny in this universe, another adaptation or comic popped up. And if I've missed something, which I probably have, let me know, because it truly has got to be one of the most massive series out there. And I think, again, it just goes to prove of how much of a cultural juggernaut Conan has been, refusing to fade away year after year, and the fandom is a real testament, keeping things alive and kicking. From fan art to fanfic, it keeps pulling people in, and it's easy to see why. There's enough materials between the books, comics, and movies to keep you busy for quite literally decades. And like I touched on before, I think it's awesome because different people latch onto different pieces of Conan, and the fact that he's hung around for so long through so many generations is just incredible. incredible, and I think the reason is because at the core, Howard really tapped into something universal. And the question is, well, why? I think what really sets Conan apart is his ability to tap into that mix of raw physical strength and philosophical depth that speaks to readers across the ages, as well as just his sheer will. On top of that, this guy is the epitome of masculinity. Conan is that dude. He lives in the moment, he's quick to act and speak his mind, and something about this speaks to generation after generation. Conan is really interesting though because he predates the tropes that would have made his character. If you tried to create someone like Conan now, you probably have to write him as a parody or some kind of deconstruction of the barbarian archetype, so I don't think we're ever going to get a character like him ever again, or at least not in the near future. In a lot of ways, Conan is kind of wish fulfillment. He's a savage in a so-called civilized world, but it's just those aspects that make him so noble. He doesn't apologize for who he is or what he does, he's just unapologetically Conan, and there's something powerful and really lasting about that, right? And then there's the world building of Conan, which isn't just a backdrop, it's a living, breathing place full of dangers, magic, and mystery. Sure, there have been countless attempts to cash in on Conan over the years, some hits and some total misfires, but in the end, they've only added to his iconic status. Somehow, this character has always remained on the fringes of pop culture, whether in movies, comics, or video games, always present and always relevant. And with fresh content on the horizon, it's clear that Conan's legend is far from fading. Though Conan was created nearly a century ago, his legacy is as alive as ever. From Howard's original stories to the silver screen and beyond, Conan has captivated generations with his sheer power, indomitable spirit, and relentless pursuit of freedom. And Conan remains a timeless icon of the fantasy genre, and I, for one, can't wait for his next adventure, the next battle, and of course, the lamentations of his enemies' women. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support. I want to give a gigantic shout out to Dan from the Conan Chronology for fact checking, and I'm going to link to his site below in the description. I also want to give another shout out to Darth Maytu's Holocron, who also did fact checking and audio plays of the original Howard stories, which are awesome. No shout out is complete without shouting out my patrons who make this channel possible. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out the link in the description below. As always, if you have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, it's really cool to hear from you guys. I've learned about a ton of great series, so please keep it coming. Thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye.
It's been more than a decade since Kevin Hart became one of the biggest names in comedy. His high-energy storytelling, full of awkward tales about his family, his childhood, and himself, made him feel authentic in a way few comics ever do. Crowds didn't just laugh with him, they connected with him. That connection turned him into a phenomenon, selling out an NFL stadium, starring in films that pulled in billions, and building a business empire that stretched from Hollywood productions to tequila, supplements, and even fast food. Kevin Hart wasn't just successful, he became unavoidable. But somewhere along the way, the underdog everyone rooted for started to disappear. The film roles began to feel recycled, the comedy louder but flatter, and the scandals, the cheating, the extortion, the Oscars fallout, made it harder to laugh along. Even his peers began to question whether Kevin was still the scrappy hustler he claimed to be, or just the polished product of a machine. By 2024, the criticism cut deeper than ever. It wasn't about his jokes or his movies anymore, it was about his influence, and whether Kevin has too much power over who makes it and who doesn't. Today, he's still winning, still expanding, and still stacking success. But what he sacrificed to get there may be the very thing that once made him special. The version of Kevin Hart that everyone fell in love with didn't just come out of nowhere. It was built and shaped by pain, dysfunction, and the pressure to survive. Raised in North Philadelphia by his mother, Nancy Hart, Kevin and his older brother, Robert, grew up in a single-parent household. Their father, Henry Witherspoon, battled drug addiction and was frequently incarcerated. When he was around, his behavior was unpredictable. Nancy stepped into both parental roles, the provider, the disciplinarian, and the emotional anchor, doing everything she could to keep her sons stable while shielding them from their father's chaos. But raising two boys alone in a tough environment came with its challenges. They struggled financially, crammed into a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood riddled with crime and drugs. Without a strong male role model, Robert got pulled into the streets. He joined a gang, started dealing, and even got caught up in a robbery. In court, he was given a choice, prison or the military, and he chose the latter. For Nancy, that was a wake-up call. She became even stricter with Kevin, keeping him busy, closely watched, and out of trouble.
My mother was strict, but she was strict because she saw mistakes that she had made with my brother and letting my brother do certain things and my brother responding to that freedom negatively. So I was the one that couldn't get out of sight. I was the one that never could do something by myself. I had extracurricular activities. I had a babysitter. I was never not watched.
That structure gave Kevin discipline early on. Over time, though, it became clear that school just wasn't his thing. He eventually dropped out of college.
Hello? Internet, are you working?
I was never not watched.
That structure gave Kevin discipline early on. Over time, though, it became clear that school just wasn't his thing. He eventually dropped out of college and took a job as a shoe salesman. Still, the work ethic his mum had drilled into him stuck, and he quickly became the top salesman at the store. But what really set him apart wasn't just his hustle, it was his energy. Kevin had this big, infectious personality that lit up every room. He always kept his co-workers and customers laughing, and one day, a colleague told him he should try stand-up at a local open mic, so he gave it a shot. From the moment he touched the mic, Kevin was hooked. The spotlight, the laughs, the connection with the crowd, it lit something inside of him. And soon, he started entering comedy competitions and winning.
The first amateur night I won, I said, this is crazy. I can't believe I won. I was performing against like 7 other people. I won. Came back the next week, I won again. Came back the next week, I won again. Came back the next week, I won again. I won 6 times, and I quit my job. I said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm a comedian. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
Surprisingly, him. She was a devout Christian who, according to Kevin, had never even watched stand-up, but she agreed to pay his rent for a year. Out, he'd go back to college. Confident he could make it, Kevin started spending time with veteran comedians like Keith Robinson and performing regularly at clubs around Philadelphia under the stage name Lil Kev the Bastard. His early sets leaned on raunchy impressions and borrowed styles, the kind of material that got laughs in quick bursts but didn't feel personal or original. The audience could tell, and the connection wasn't there. Determined to get better, he hit the road, performing anywhere he could. New York, Philly, Boston, city after city, club after club. The grind wasn't easy. He got booed off stage more than once, and at one particularly brutal gig in a strip club, someone threw a chicken wing at his face.
A guy threw the wing at me. I was like, why are you even here? That's what I was thinking in my mind. He was like, hey man, enough.
Yeah.
What is going on with the internet?
Came back the next week, I won again. Came back the next week, I won again. I won 6 times, and I quit my job. I said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm a comedian. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
Surprisingly, his mother backed him. She was a devout Christian who, according to Kevin, had never even watched stand-up, but she agreed to pay his rent for a year on the condition that if it didn't work out, he'd go back to college. Confident he could make it, Kevin started spending time with veteran comedians like Keith Robinson and performing regularly at clubs around Philadelphia under the stage name Lil Kev the Bastard. His early sets leaned on raunchy impressions and borrowed styles, the kind of material that got laughs in quick bursts but didn't feel personal or original. The audience could tell, and the connection wasn't there. Determined to get better, he hit the road, performing anywhere he could. New York, Philly, Boston, city after city, club after club. The grind wasn't easy. He got booed off stage more than once, and at one particularly brutal gig in a strip club, someone threw a chicken wing at his face.
A guy threw the wing at me. I was like, why are you even here? That's what I was thinking in my mind. He was like, hey, man, enough.
Yeah.
And he just threw a saucy buffalo wing at me, hit me in the side of the face.
But Kevin wasn't discouraged. Instead, he adapted. Those rough nights taught him something crucial. Audiences connected more when he told more personal stories. So he leaned into that and started telling stories from his own life, his insecurities, his strict upbringing, and his complicated relationship with his drug-addicted father. That shift didn't make him a star overnight, but it did change the way crowds responded. Slowly, the buzz around his stand-up began to grow. He was still grinding, traveling city to city playing small clubs, but now people remembered him. One of those people was director Judd Apatow, who liked what he saw and cast Kevin in a recurring role on the 2001 sitcom Undeclared. It wasn't a starring role, but it put Kevin on a network set for the first time and introduced him to an entirely new audience. Off the back of that, he began booking small but steady parts in films like Paper Soldiers and Scary Movie 3, slowly building his resume. Around that same time, Kevin married his college sweetheart, Torrey Skipper, and it felt like all the pieces were finally falling into place. His momentum kept building when he landed his first starring role with The Big House, a sitcom he was not only the lead in, but also created. Loosely inspired by The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, it followed a rich Malibu kid forced to move in with his relatives in Philadelphia. ABC, the network behind it, seemed all in. They even flew Kevin out to present the show to advertisers. This was supposed to be his moment, but just seconds before going on stage to introduce the show, everything collapsed.
I'm next to walk on stage so they can announce The Big House. You're the guy with the microphone that's backstage managing the... This is what I see. He's right here. I'm with him. All right, I'll tell him right now. Kevin, hold up 1 second. They just said they're not going to go through or pick it up. Somebody should be back here to talk to you shortly.
Just like that, it was over. Kevin had poured everything he had into The Big House, only to be told moments before stepping on stage to promote it that ABC wasn't going to pick it up. It was only later that he learned the full picture. The network would still air the 6 episodes that had already been made, but there would be no future beyond that. From the moment it premiered, Kevin knew the show was already over. Still, hope remained. He just landed his first leading film role in Soul Plane, sharing the screen with big names like Snoop Dogg, Method Man, Monique, and a then up-and-coming Sofia Vergara. The film had a built-in audience and the potential to be a breakout hit for him. But before it could even make it to theaters, disaster struck. A leaked copy of the film spread online months before its official release, gutting any momentum. By the time
What is with the internet? What's going on?
Lines you wouldn't hear in a superhero movie.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Whatever it is, it's heading straight for the World Trade Center.
Has there ever been a more iconic character than Superman? first appearing in Action Comics 1, authored and illustrated by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the character has become an unmistakable icon of American pop culture. From his debut in 1938, Superman's influence completely changed the creative direction of the American comics industry, with the character effectively inspiring an entirely new genre that has permanently altered the media landscape. The superhero genre has completely dominated American comics for almost a century, while adaptations of popular superhero characters have become some of the most successful films, TV shows, and video games ever released. Almost every single superhero can trace their creative origin to Superman, so with the overwhelming presence of superhero adaptations in film and television over the last decade, it seems odd that Superman himself is noticeably kind of absent. With the proven success and popularity of superhero stories, it seems obvious that film studios should capitalize with a new adaptation of the genre's original iconic character. And well, they definitely tried. In 2013, Warner Bros. Released the now infamous Man of Steel, a $225 million Superman movie written by David S. Goyer and directed by Zack Snyder that was supposed to kickstart an entire cinematic universe. But even though the film technically succeeded financially, its reception among critics and fans proved a bit more controversial. While some people praise the film as an interesting reinterpretation of the character, many fans were left unsatisfied with the movie's portrayal of Superman and the film's overall writing quality in general. So with the latest cinematic Superman adaptation arriving this year, I wanted to revisit Warner Bros.' previous attempt to bring the character to the big screen, to re-examine the critical problems of Man of Steel and discover how you fail at Superman. For context, let's start with a quick history lesson. While superhero adaptations have always made for popular blockbusters, the cultural and financial dominance of superhero films really began with the MCU. Starting in the early 2010s, Disney Studios began using their limited rights to Marvel Comics characters to create a series of interconnected films dubbed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A long-term experiment that paid off with the 2012 crossover movie Avengers, which broke box office records to become the highest-grossing comic book film yet released. Seeing this success and recognizing the potential, Warner Bros. Decided to emulate this model to build their own cinematic universe by using their rights to characters from the rival brand DC Comics. Their first attempt was a Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds, but after a disastrous commercial and critical reception, they decided to try a different approach. Now, Warner Bros. Already had a successful ongoing superhero franchise of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, so studio executives decided to capitalize off of this success and approached him to produce a Superman film in the same continuity. But Nolan ultimately refused since he didn't want his films or characters to be subject or associated with the demands of a wider cinematic universe. Instead, he recommended Zack Snyder. Now, Snyder already had a proven track record with comic book movies, with his incredibly popular adaptation of Frank Miller's 300 and a surprisingly well-received take on Watchmen that made him an obvious choice for creative lead on the project. But more importantly, he shared Nolan's creative vision for a more realistic and grounded portrayal of a character, with Nolan specifically recommending Snyder for his innate aptitude for dealing with superheroes as real characters. This focus on mature realism had defined the movie since its earliest stages of production. As scriptwriter David Goyer described, what Christopher Nolan and I have done with Superman is trying to bring the same naturalistic approach we adopted for the Batman trilogy. We want our stories to be rooted in reality, like they could happen in the same world we live in. Zack Snyder himself would continue to repeat this sentiment in interviews following the film's release, saying, "I think with Superman, we have the opportunity to place this icon within the sort of real world we live in, and this philosophy explains almost every element of the film's production." This is particularly noticeable in the cinematography. In contrast to the deliberate framing and long exposure of Snyder's earlier work, the photography of Man of Steel was deliberately more unpolished and naturalistic. The camera work was specifically chosen to imitate documentary footage, with techniques like unfocused snap zooms and handheld shaky cam used frequently to make the footage feel like real recordings taken from an in-universe perspective. There was also an increased focus on detailing in the environment and costume design, especially for the film's alien elements. In keeping with Goyer's earliest conceptions of the film dealing with the conflict between Superman's upbringing and alien origins, extra attention was dedicated to fleshing out the visual design of his home planet Krypton, including conceptual architecture, wildlife design, and even creating an original written language. If you look closely, this language is actually featured in the texture details of Superman's suit, which was also redesigned with classic elements like the belt and tights replaced with decorative piping and matching cuffs to make it feel more regal and alien. In general, there was a deliberate effort to differentiate descriptions of the film dealing with the conflict between Superman's upbringing and alien origins. Extra attention was dedicated to fleshing out the visual design of his home planet Krypton, including conceptual architecture, wildlife design, and even creating an original written language. If you look closely, this language is actually featured in the texture details of Superman's suit, which was also redesigned with classic elements like the belt and tights replaced with decorative piping and matching cuffs to make it feel more regal and alien. In general, there was a deliberate effort to differentiate Man of Steel from existing conceptions of a character. This wasn't your grandpa's Superman. As Goyer described, we're approaching Superman as if it weren't a comic book movie, as if it were real. I adore the Donner films, absolutely adore them. It just struck me that there was an idealist quality to them that may or may not work with today's audience. Again, just like the Dark Knight trilogy, Man of Steel is specifically intended to reimagine a version of Superman that would be successful with contemporary audiences. But the most interesting and controversial part of this creative decision was how it affected the filmmaker's approach to characterizing and conflict. Visually and tonally, Man of Steel is noticeably darker than previous Superman movies, with a lot more emphasis on fight scenes and the resulting collateral destruction and the psychological flaws of its characters. Zack Snyder explicitly stated in a 2014 interview with Forbes that we really wanted to show it wasn't just like the PG-13 version where everyone just gets up and they're fine. I really wanted to show that the violence is real. People get killed or get hurt and it's not fun or funny. And I think understanding this is the best way to critically approach Man of Steel. Not by complaining about the film's tone or creative direction, but by analysing how well it actually achieves the realistic stakes and character drama the filmmakers were aiming for. So with all that additional context out of the way, let's finally look at the actual content of Man of Steel and see what went wrong with this reimagining of Superman. The first issues with Man of Steel's reimagining of Superman appear in the opening sequence in the additional context it adds to its character's origin story. Like most adaptations, the film opens with the birth of its protagonist on the planet Krypton, with his parents sending him to Earth in a rocket ship just before the planet's destruction. But while this first seems like a standard retelling of a classic mythology, the new details included in this adaptation start to create some issues. For example, in his conversation with the Kryptonian Council, Superman's father Jor-El highlights the imminent danger while stressing the need to evacuate. And this is how that conversation goes.
Do you not understand? Krypton's core is collapsing. We may only have a matter of weeks. I warned you. Harvesting the core was suicide. It has accelerated the process of implosion.
Our energy reserves were exhausted. What would you have us do, Al?
Look to the stars. Like our ancestors did. There are habitable worlds within reach. We can begin by using the old outposts.
Are you seriously suggesting that we evacuate the entire planet?
No. Everybody here is already dead.
So this isn't a great start. Apparently in this adaptation, the Council are aware that Krypton's core is collapsing due to their energy mining program. But when Jor-El suggests they evacuate to nearby planets, they dismiss this idea because it would be difficult? Jor-El's dialogue specifically describes habitable worlds within our reach, implying there are livable planets they have the means to travel to. And this lady can't be bothered because they might not get everyone? I mean, you'd think they'd at least try, right? Save themselves at least? It might sound pedantic, but these additional changes really damage this adaptation by making the story far less believable. And for an obvious comparison, just see how much better Superman the Animated Series handles the same material.
Each of you should have my report. It distills all the data I've gathered so far and leaves no doubt that the planet's core is undergoing a mounting chain reaction that will eventually destroy Krypton. Lunacy!
Ask Brainiac!
Yes, Brainiac! He'll tell us!
Unlike Man of Steel, in the animated series, Krypton's council isn't aware of imminent destruction of their planet, and are being deceived by the AI Brainiac telling them everything is normal.
One can appreciate Jor-El's hard work. However, he is still mistaken. As I've stated before, the Templars are the result of a slight polar shift, no more, and will soon...
He's wrong! He doesn't know!
This is a much better explanation for their inaction since they have no proof their planet is in danger and are actively being deceived into thinking otherwise. But they're still willing to hear out Jor-El's proposal, which brings us to the next improvement.
Your faith in him will be the end of us all. Act now and we can save everyone.
And how do you propose to do that?
Put everyone in the Phantom Zone.
Again, unlike Man of Steel, where Jor-El's plan is as simple as why don't we just move everyone to a nearby planet, in the animated series, Jor-El suggests storing their population in dimensional prison and transporting them to safety via experimental rocket. This also makes a lot more sense than the movie, since Jor-El's proposal to the Council involves freezing their whole population in stasis prison designed for criminals instead of why don't we just go somewhere else.
You're asking us to voluntarily put ourselves among the vilest criminals in the galaxy? You're mad!
We can restore ourselves later, on another planet. It would only take one man. Listen to me! I built a ship! Listen, please!
Only 2 minutes into the opening scene, and despite the filmmaker's focus on realism, Man of Steel's approach to the Superman mythos is noticeably worse than the cartoon released nearly 20 years earlier. But things only get worse later in the movie when Clark finds a digital copy of his father's personality on a crashed Kryptonian ship, and he explains more of our planet's history, and we find out how that ship got there.
Long ago, in an era of expansion, our race spread out through the stars, seeking new worlds to settle upon. This scout ship was one of thousands launched into the void. We built outposts on other planets, using great machines to reshape environments to our needs. For 100,000 years, our civilization flourished.
100,000 years. The Kryptonians had access to interstellar travel for 100,000 years, and they all died when Krypton blew up. Right. It's hard to explain how badly this exposition damages the story, so let's break down each problem one by one. See, what makes Superman's tragic origin as the last survivor of Krypton so meaningful is that he was the only one to escape the planet's destruction. But this story really loses its impact if you establish that the rest of them could just leave. In the comics, Clark only survived because his father used his knowledge as a scientist to build an experimental rocket that could travel interstellar distances but only carry one passenger. It was a last resort to save his son, and they couldn't save anyone else because they just didn't have the technology. But Man of Steel establishes Krypton has had this technology for hundreds of centuries, yet none of them decided to leave their exploding planet? This exposition only makes Jor-El's conversation with the Council more absurd in retrospect, because now we know they could order an evacuation and leave at any time, but for some reason they just refuse, and the film never gives us an explanation why. Furthermore, during his monologue, Jor-El specifically describes how Kryptonians spread out to the stars seeking new worlds to settle on, and yet now Krypton is dying because they started mining their planet's core for energy? So, even ignoring the questionable resource logistics of mining a planet's core, it should go without saying that this doesn't make any sense given what we know about Krypton's space exploration. If you have access to interstellar travel, then you essentially have access to unlimited resources. You can go wherever you like and grab whatever you need. So even if they absolutely needed resources from the planet's core for some reason, then why didn't the Kryptonians just mine another planet instead of the one they live on? There are plenty of other planets out there, their options are pretty open. Besides, even if the Council isn't convinced, if the Kryptonians had this technology, then surely Zod or Jor-El could lead some kind of evacuation movement. Who cares if you have a Council's permission, just get people off the planet. All of this demonstrates the first major issue with how Man of Steel reimagines the Superman mythos. Despite all the time the film spends introducing new information, there doesn't seem to be any consideration for how any of these elements actually work together, or what they imply about this world or its characters. The film just presents a bunch of different sci-fi concepts with no concern for how any of them might interact or affect each other. Which is how we get a society with centuries of interstellar travel that all died because none of them left their exploding planet. And this seriously hurts the movie because our suspension of disbelief is constantly being challenged by information that doesn't make sense. Which is bizarre considering the film's production, because with all the time spent aesthetically designing Krypton, you'd think they'd spend more effort developing the history and culture of a planet in a way which better informs the events of a story. But the bigger problem with this type of lazy world building is how this additional context inevitably alters our perception of the film's characters. Which brings us to our final issue. If Krypton has had interstellar travel for 100,000 years, and Jor-El knew the planet was about to explode, then why didn't he just leave? Why not try to save as many people as he could instead of sending Clark to Earth alone? Well, Clark asked this exact same question, and this is the answer.
Why didn't you come with me? We couldn't, Cal. No matter how much we wanted to. No matter how much we loved you. Your mother, Lara, and I were a product of the failures of our world as much as Zod was. Tied to its fate.
Okay, so to really understand the implication of this statement, we need to go back to the introduction scene and another major detail about Kryptonian society. After his meeting with the Council is interrupted by Zod's military takeover, Jor-El escapes Zod's soldiers and travels to a location we only fully understand later.
This is a Genesis chamber. All Kryptonians were conceived in chambers such as this. Every child was designed to fulfill a predetermined role in our society. As a worker, a warrior, a leader, so on.
Basically, aside from Clark, all the Kryptonian characters we see in the movie are the product of genetic engineering, which programs them with specialized skills for their role in society. What makes Clark so special is that he was born normally, outside the Genesis chamber and without any modifications. As Jor-El explains, the reason he did this was because he saw genetic engineering as an unethical mistake.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious, the element of choice, of chance. What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her? What if a child aspired to something greater?
He even lists Krypton's reliance on genetic engineering as one of the things that led to its downfall.
What happened? Artificial population control was established. The outposts and space exploration were abandoned. We exhausted our natural resources. As a result, our planet's core became unstable.
So when he describes how he and his wife were the product of the failures of our world to explain why they couldn't leave with Clark, he seems to be referencing their nature as genetically modified Kryptonians as the reason they didn't try to leave the planet. Essentially, Jor-El believed that Kryptonian society collapsed as a consequence of our genetic engineering program, and that saving any modified Kryptonians would mean preserving the cultural practices that doomed their society. Which explains why he didn't try to save anybody but Clark despite knowing that Krypton was going to blow up and having the technology to evacuate. To put this another way, in Man of Steel, the reason Jor-El didn't bother to save any other Kryptonians was because he didn't believe their lives were worth saving. Holy shit, that is awful. Like, with everything the audience understands about the setting, Jor-El is refusing to save billions of sentient lives because he considers them genetic failures. And what makes this situation somehow worse is that his justification doesn't even make any sense. I mean, his entire plan was to have a normal baby with his wife, proving that genetically modified Kryptonians can still produce unaltered offspring. So even if they only saved engineered Kryptonians, then the population would become completely normal in just one generation. This guy is supposed to be a scientist, how did he not figure this out? The only way you could potentially justify this would be that he was concerned they would eventually default to their programming and restart the cultural practices that doom their society. But this argument still falls apart since Jor-El himself is proof that genetically modified Kryptonians can act outside their society's values. He could have just escaped with a group of people that had similar beliefs. Instead, he chose to let everyone die. Again, this is the problem with lazy world building. A film's setting affects its character writing because the implications of their actions will depend on what we know about their environment. The audience forms their opinion on the characters based on what opportunities we know are available to them versus what they actually decide to do. So if the scriptwriters haven't considered how different elements of a setting will inform their characters' behavior, then their decisions can have some seriously unfortunate implications. I mean, I doubt the filmmakers intended to characterize Jor-El as an evil nihilistic eugenicist, but this is the only interpretation of his character which makes sense with the information presented by the film. There's no other logical way to explain his actions. But what somehow makes his characterizing even worse is that even the most generous explanation of Jor-El's values is still contradicted by some of his seemingly inexplicable decisions. I mean, if Jor-El was really concerned that his genetic programming would make him a negative influence, then why attach a digital copy of his personality to Clark's ship? Why is this exposition scene even happening? Also, for as much importance as Jor-El puts on free will and the right to self-determinism, the advice he gives to Clark is really demanding. Listening to his dialogue with Clark could easily give you whiplash because he constantly switches between encouraging him to choose his own destiny while also demanding that his son assume the role of a savior figure.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious, the element of choice, of chance.
We wanted you to learn what it meant to be human first, so that one day, when the time was right, you could be the bridge between two peoples.
What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her?
You can save her, Cal. You can save all of them.
Furthermore, in the climax of the introduction, right before he sends Clark to Earth, Jor-El uses a machine to imbue his son with an item he stole from a Genesis chamber. Later in the film, this weird skull thing is revealed to be the Codex, which contains all the genetic information needed for Kryptonian engineering, and Jor-El decides to store this information in his son's body. But why not just destroy it? I mean, it's clear Kryptonians can reproduce without needing the Codex, or Clark's parents couldn't have secretly conceived him before Jor-El stole it. Later in the movie, General Zod's entire plan to rebuild Krypton relies on finding the information from the Codex and using it to restart their genetic engineering, which he wouldn't have been able to do if Jor-El didn't store that information in Clark. So if Jor-El really wanted to end genetic engineering, then why not just destroy the Codex? Why preserve a technology he spent his whole life fighting against in the body of his infant son? How does that make any sense for his character? These decisions are major driving forces for the plot, but they completely contradict everything the audience understands about Jor-El's values and motivations. In short, he sucks. All of it sucks. Despite spending over 20 minutes on the introduction and even more exposition to establish the setting, none of this new information is coherent with the actual events of the story. Instead, the changes made to the Superman mythos and the elements introduced by the scriptwriters actively conflicts with his origin story while damaging the morality of his legacy characters. And while Jor-El himself is just a secondary cast member, this type of character writing affects every character in Man of Steel, especially the protagonist. After Krypton finally blows up and the introduction section is finished, the film spends the next sequence of scenes establishing Clark as a character. This is achieved via a non-linear montage that conveys Clark's journey into adulthood by showcasing his lived experiences. So to analyse how this movie handles Clark's character, let's break down each scene chronologically and explore what they establish about his personality and internal conflict. Now, Goyer has stated in interviews that these cuts between Clark's past and present are to indicate how the lessons Clark learned in childhood are informing his current day actions. But when you actually analyse a montage, the adjacent scenes don't really have any relevance to each other. Let me show you what I mean. Our first introduction to Clark shows him working on a fishing boat before hearing a distress call from the US Coast Guard, and helping them rescue a group of oil workers from an exploding sea rig. The next scene cuts to a moment in Clark's childhood where his super senses make him overwhelmed at school, and he locks himself away in a closet before his mum arrives to calm him down. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the relevance between these scenes is supposed to be. Clark isn't being overwhelmed like he was in a flashback. If anything, you'd think learning how to manage his super senses would mean he'd notice this falling fish trap, but whatever. Also, how strong is this guy who tackled him? Gosh. Besides the obvious visual parallel between Clark's relationship with his mum and the wailing calf he sees when he regains consciousness, thematically, this combination doesn't really say anything. But individually, these scenes essentially tell us two things. Firstly, Clark has decided to live anonymously alongside regular humans, but is willing to publicly reveal his powers to save people in danger. Secondly, Clark struggled with adapting with his powers growing up, which ostracized him from his peers, and his parents were his greatest support during this period. So far, this is honestly pretty good stuff. The first scene effectively establishes Clark's current situation for the audience and demonstrates his moral values with him helping people in danger, while the second scene endears him for us through his relationship with his parents while realistically exploring the struggles his superpowers would cause. It's good characterization that efficiently introduces all the important concepts that will be relevant for Clark's character, but it's the way Man of Steel builds on this foundation which starts to create some problems. After the first flashback, the film cuts to Clark stealing some random guy's clothes after getting out of the ocean, before he travels into town and a school bus reminds him of another core memory. While this segment doesn't really achieve anything outside of basic plot progression, and the fact that Clark would rather steal clothes than embarrass himself, the transition is clearly relevant and the next clip is essential since it introduces his internal conflict. The scene opens with Clark being bullied on a bus ride to school before an accident on a bridge sends a vehicle into a river, after which Clark saves his classmates by pushing the school bus ashore. This is one of the better scenes in the montage since it reinforces Clark's existing characterization by showing him feeling outcasted but still committed to saving lives and helping people. I particularly like the detail where you think he's looking at his classmates' reaction to his abilities, but he was actually scanning for anyone he missed, and goes back under the water to fetch the bully. It really highlights his selflessness by showing his priority to protect people over his self-image. But the flashback continues and we see Pete's mum, that's the name of a bully from the school bus, confronting Clark's parents about his role in the accident.
My son was there. He was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
I know he did. I'm sure what he thought he saw
was an act of God, Jonathan. This was providence.
When Clark storms off, Jonathan goes after him to give him a lecture on the situation.
I just wanted to help.
I know you did, but we talked about this. Right?
It's clear this is a conversation they've had before.
Oh, Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
This is an interesting point to lecture on, since if Clark didn't reveal his powers to help his classmates, then everyone on that bus would have drowned. And when Clark asks his dad how he should have handled the situation, this is his response.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
What the fuck? Okay, so Jonathan's response here, and honestly his entire character, has become one of the most controversial parts of the movie. So let's analyze his dialogue here and try to understand his reasoning.
There's more at stake here than just our lives, Clark, or the lives of those around us. When the world finds out what you can do, it's going to change everything. You saw how Pete's mom reacted, right? She was scared of Clark.
Essentially, Jonathan is encouraging Clark to avoid using his powers because he's worried how people would react to his abilities. He knows how people would be intimidated and wants to protect Clark from the mental and possibly physical danger of that kind of backlash. But if his goal is to protect Clark's mental state, then scolding him for his decision to rescue the bus is bizarre considering what the alternative outcome would mean. If Clark didn't reveal his powers to rescue his classmates, he would have been the only child to survive the accident and had to live with the guilt of letting them die while dealing with the resentment of all their parents. That's a lot for a kid to grow up with. Pete's mum and her concerns seem pretty easily brushed aside, and we don't see any consequences for Clark's rescue outside of her confrontation. So with the choice between let 30 innocent children die and live with the regret versus become the centre of town gossip for a week, I'd say Clark made the right call, and it's bizarre to see Jonathan scold him for it. But the more important issue of Jonathan Kent's dialogue is how his advice is used to set up Clark's internal conflict. As this film has already established, Clark has struggled with the consequences of his powers growing up and wants to use his abilities to help people. So by contrasting Clark saving the bus with his father's warnings, these scenes combine to introduce a protagonist's internal conflict, that Clark using his powers to help people could create serious consequences for him. But the issue here is that the only challenges Clark actually faces for helping people are the disapproving lectures of his father. We never actually see Clark facing consequences for his decisions. There's no scene where his classmates don't interact with him out of fear, or their parents tell them to stay away from him, or even investigation from law enforcement. Instead, it's just Clark dealing with his father's nagging that revealing his powers would be worse than letting innocent children die. Man, what is it with Clark's father figures and advocating manslaughter? This is such a bizarre trend. So this isn't a great foundation for Clark's internal conflict, but unfortunately things only get worse as the film develops, so let's go on with the montage. The last thing this scene shows us is Jonathan revealing the ship Clark arrived on and explaining his alien origin when his son asks where he came from, which gives us this touching performance and their most heartwarming interaction in the movie.
Can I just keep pretending I'm your son?
You are my son.
I only wish the rest of their scenes were like this. The next scene cuts to Clark working anonymously at a bar where he overhears two soldiers discussing an alien crash site. Before a trucker sexually assaults a waitress and he intervenes to help her. At first it seems like this scene is developing the internal conflict introduced previously, with Clark wanting to stand up for people in trouble but not wanting to reveal his true powers or expose himself. But then after the trucker pours his drink over him and then hits him with the bottle, he goes outside and does this to their truck. What? Okay, I know a lot of Superman fans were upset with the way this scene characterizes him as a bitter arsehole who's afraid of public confrontation, but the bigger issue here is how the fuck did he manage this without anyone noticing? Again, Clark is supposed to be avoiding people discovering his powers, so why did he make such an obvious showcase of them, and how did nobody notice him smashing logs through this truck? Did no one in the bar hear what he was doing or come out and see him destroying this vehicle? Or did he pull it somewhere else to do this and no one saw or heard him drag it back? Is that still going to make a lot of noise? Either way, Clark is doing a terrible job at hiding his abilities, which really contradicts how much importance the earlier scene placed on keeping his powers a secret. Like, you'd think he'd just drag the guy outside by the collar or whatever instead of doing all this. It bears repeating that once again, there isn't a lot of relevance between this scene and the previous flashback. But what's bizarre is that there's actually a flashback scene with more significance to this section which appears after the montage is finished. Just before he confronts Zod, Clark remembers an encounter with his childhood bullies where he restrained himself from using his super strength to avoid hurting them, just like his conflict with the trucker. It's completely out of place given the context, and it genuinely seems like somebody made an editing mistake and they just left it in the movie. Anyway, the scene ends as we see Clark hitchhiking to the crash site those soldiers mentioned, hoping to learn more about his alien heritage. And we transition to the next section. Also, just to recap the plot here, Clark's job on a random fishing boat got him caught up in rescuing some oil workers. after which he washed ashore and took up a job in the one town at the one bar where some random soldiers just happened to be talking about an alien crash site. That is some insane coincidence, but whatever. We next see Clark working as a luggage carrier at the military camp the US government set up outside the crash site, where he helps a certain reporter with her equipment before sneaking out at night to go to the spaceship. This is also the scene that introduces Lois Lane, but I'll save her analysis for later since we're focusing on Clark for now. When he laces aboard the spaceship, Clark has a hostile encounter with a ship's security drones before inserting the USB token Jor-El gave him. This makes the robots ignore him while summoning a mysterious hologram of Jor-El who quietly walks out of sight. I don't know why he's being so dramatic, like, just go talk to your son, dude. Clark follows after him but overhears Lois getting attacked by the security drones, and comes to her rescue, crushing the robot with his bare hands before tending to her injury, saying,
I can do things that other people can't.
Which is one hell of an understatement. I hope Clark has cauterized a wound with his lasers before because that could have gone really badly. Anyway, the spaceship takes off and flies Clark away to a remote island before the hologram of Jor-El finally faces him. Lois isn't with them anymore, so we can only guess Clark just dumped her outside before the ship left. This is where we get that exposition between him and Clark that we discussed earlier, but the more important takeaway for Clark's character in this scene are his interactions with Lois. We know from the previous scenes that Clark is supposed to be following his parents' warnings to hide his powers, and has been trying to uncover the mystery behind his alien origins. But this scene shows him publicly displaying his powers to save Lois while ignoring potential information about his heritage, showing how he cares more about helping people than his alien ancestry or his parents' advice, which is actually consistent with what we've seen earlier. Remember how the first time we saw Clark, he very publicly displayed his powers to rescue a group of workers from an exploding oil rig. And in this scene, he has no hesitation saving Lois, someone he knows is a reporter from their earlier encounter, despite the potential consequences he was warned about. There's a clear disconnect here between what Clark's dad says he should do versus what Clark actually wants to do and how we see him behave, which is directly addressed in the later scene where Lois confronts him about it by tracking him down through the people he's rescued.
I figured if I turned over enough stones, you'd eventually find me.
This exchange is essential to understand Clark's characterizing because their conversation highlights the main contradiction in his behavior across all the scenes of the montage. Lois points out that Clark's attempts to stay hidden will inevitably conflict with his desire to help people.
The only way you could disappear for good is to stop helping people altogether, and I sense that's not an option for you.
Which prompts Clark to explain his reasoning by telling her about his father. After which the film transitions to a flashback where we learn about the death of John Kent. Alright, the scene where Jonathan dies is simultaneously one of the most controversial parts of the movie while also being the most important scene to understand Clark's character, so let's start with some context. Now, the death of Clark's father is an event that has been retold, retconned and paraphrased countless times across Superman's continuity and adaptations. But despite all the different variants across the decades, there are some details which have been reused unchanged for their thematic significance. Notably, Jonathan's most common cause of death is typically a heart attack or some other terminal illness rather than the physical danger of some grand spectacle. Which is significant because it means that Jonathan's death is something that Clark, despite his abilities, doesn't have the power to change, which helps humanize him for the audience. As Clark directly states in the 1978 film adaptation,
"All those things I can do, all those powers, and I couldn't even save him."
The death of Clark's father helps make his character relatable to us despite his incredible powers and abilities. But more importantly, Jonathan's death serves as an essential part of his motivation as Superman. Because thematically, by showing Clark there are some things his powers just can't do, it inspires him to do everything he can do to improve the lives of those around him. It's classic superhero motivation. Man of Steel takes a different approach. The flashback opens with another argument between teenage Clark and his father about what he should do with his powers the rest of his life.
I just want to do something useful with my life. So farming, feeding people, that's not useful. I didn't say that.
It's clear the scene is intended to build on their conflict after the school bus incident, but their conversation is interrupted when an oncoming tornado forces everyone on the road to evacuate to safety. While escorting people to an overpass, Martha realizes they left the family dog behind and Clark offers to fetch it before his dad stops him, tells him to get people to shelter and goes back himself. It's clear he's trying to stop Clark from revealing his powers, but while rescuing the dog, Jonathan's leg is injured and caught under a fallen car, making him unable to escape the tornado. Clark sees his father about to die, but before he can go out to rescue him, Jonathan raises his hand telling him to stop, accepting his death while protecting his son. Right. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's start with the basics. Mechanically, the setup here is incredibly contrived. None of the characters behave realistically given the situation, and their reactions are clearly intended just to set up problems for the main cast. Like, when they see the tornado coming, all of these people decide to get out of their cars for some reason instead of just making a U-turn and driving away. They also decide to shelter under the overpass, which the National Weather Service describes as one of the worst possible shelter spaces, and I feel like people who live in Kansas should know this, but the scriptwriters didn't do their research. Man, this guy just keeps giving terrible advice, huh? But by far the biggest problem with this scene is that the protagonist's decisions are completely inconsistent with their values. Because while it makes sense for Jonathan to sacrifice himself to protect his son's identity from the world, there's absolutely no reason why Clark wouldn't try to save his dad. The film's attempted justification for this is stated after the flashback when Clark explains to Lois,
I let my father die because I trusted him. Because he was convinced that I had to wait. That the world was not ready.
But that doesn't make any sense since, as we've seen throughout this montage, Clark has zero issue exposing his powers to help people, and close family members should be no exception. He saves his schoolmates from drowning before his father's lecture, and we know he goes on to save Lois and the oil workers during his adulthood despite knowing the risks. Hell, he wouldn't even need his powers to save Jonathan. A normal guy with his build could just run over and carry him back no problem. So given how the scene opens on Clark actively disagreeing with his father's advice, there's no reason he should be following it now just to watch Jonathan die. Because not only is it a completely unrealistic decision that almost no actual person would ever make, but it completely contradicts his existing characterization and everything the audience understands about his values. Seriously, why show your powers to help kids, hide them to let your dad die, then show them later to save oil riggers? This is just nonsense. Ultimately, instead of Jonathan's death being a humanizing moment that inspires Clark to use his powers for good, his sacrifice in Man of Steel arguably dehumanizes Clark by making him act out of character just to watch his father die. But the scene only gets worse when you realize how Jonathan's death recontextualizes Clark's behavior across the montage. Remember how throughout the present-day scenes, Clark has been living anonymously, just drifting from place to place. And every time he uses his powers, he's always abandoned his current job and gone somewhere else. It's clear from this pattern of behavior that Jonathan's warnings are still affecting him, but as Lois highlights during their conversation,
The only way you could disappear for good is to stop helping people altogether, and I sense that's not an option for you.
as we've seen through the montage, Clark clearly wants to help people. He wants to use his powers to save lives and make the world a better
Is anybody in stream? I think I'm all alone in here.
fear of the consequences they warned about. One could easily
In case I'm not, I had thought that I would eat and then I would resume the stream.
argue this was
But I think I'm just gonna end the stream now.
change the effect we've seen his advice have on Clark across the montage, meaning that the scriptwriters effectively
Brother Dwight, are you in here?
in opposition to his upbringing from his parents, which is one hell of a departure from the character's mythos. In previous adaptations, Pa Kent's advice to his son is typically shown as the backbone of Superman's moral compass that drives his actions moving forward. In Man of Steel, John Kent's parenting is more like a trauma Clark has to recover from to become the person he always wanted to be. No wonder fans were pissed. How do you fuck this up? Now, this internal conflict could still technically work if these ideas were further explored through the story and John's advice clearly informed Clark's behavior across the movie. But as we'll soon discuss, this film has other priorities. This is the part of the story where Zod arrives on Earth, so now seems like the perfect time to talk about this movie's central antagonist. Now, during the last two sections, we analysed Clark and Jor-El's character rising by breaking down their actions to determine their values and motivations. But unlike either of those characters, Zod's values and motivations are explicitly spelled out for us in his monologue before fighting Clark in the finale.
I exist only to protect Krypton. That is the sole purpose for which I was born. And every action I take, no matter how violent or how cruel, is for the greater good of my people.
Great dialogue here, guys, really subtle. So for Zod's analysis, instead of trying to decipher his character by chronologically breaking down his actions, I want to try the opposite approach, and test whether his actions are consistent with his stated character. Let's get started. Zod is first introduced in the opening sequence where he interrupts Jor-El's meeting with the Council by staging a military coup to take over the planet. When Jor-El asks what he's doing, Zod responds,
What I should have done years ago. These lawmakers, with their endless debates, have led Krypton to ruin.
and this explanation seems to make perfect sense for his character. As he directly stated for the audience, Zod defines himself and his ambitions by the societal role he was genetically engineered for. This makes him a narrative foil for Clark, who was conceived without a specific role and has spent the